Chapter 350, Perfect Match 1. Although He Sanling wasn't surprised, he still felt ambivalent. Xiao Hongyu, on the other hand, didn't have heavy thoughts brewing in his head like Yichangdi. Instead, his curiosity was like a million cat claws scratching at the walls of his heart. He couldn't sit still any longer and tried to urge Yichangdi on. Brother He, what are you in a daze for? Quick, open it and see what's inside. With such a nice box, surely it wouldn't turn out to be jewelry? He really couldn't think of an accessory that a man would wear. For Yichangdi, it was impossible to think with such a noisy guy right next to him. Thus, he abandoned his train of thought and turned his focus to the box. It couldn't be opened straightforwardly. Yichangdi located the hidden mechanism and pressed down, releasing the lock. The exquisitely fragrant rosewood box popped open with a clack. Nestled within the dark red silk-lined box was a dark green piece of jade in the shape of a thumb ring. Its vibrant color and glossy surface were a testament to its quality. It even seemed to glow in the light. Although Xiao Hongyu didn't understand the finer points of jade quality, he could tell with one glance that something of this color and texture was definitely high quality. Furthermore, as a military man, Xiao Hongyu could immediately tell what the item was. A thumb ring. The lowest-ranked foot soldiers of the Great Wu dynasty were given bows and arrows. Thus, thumb rings were something that almost every soldier would use. Some of the standard thumb rings would have grooves to help with holding the bowstring. The most common type of thumb rings were made of elk horn and were rather cheap in the Great Wu dynasty. Xiao Hongyu was a little jealous upon seeing Yichangdi's gift. The thumb ring he was wearing now was only made of elk horn. He certainly didn't own any made out of jade. How nice it was to have a wife. Brother He, quick, put it on and see if it fits. Yichangdi stared at the green jade thumb ring for a moment, but instead of putting it on, he closed the lid and didn't say a word. Xiao Hongyu immediately grew anxious. Brother He, aren't you going to try it on? When that didn't work, Xiao Hongyu smiled and then began to cajole. Brother He, if you're not going to use it, then why don't you lend it to me? The one I'm using is just made of elk horn. It's not really good, and it usually rubs against my skin. See, I'm getting a blister on my thumb from it. Yichangdi gripped the wooden box in his hands and cast a cool look at the shameless Xiao Hongyu, who said I'm not going to wear it. After saying so, he took out the green Hatian jade thumb ring and put it onto his right thumb. Although He Sanling regularly practiced martial arts, resulting in some calluses on his hands, his fingers were long and slender. His hand was so slim that his finger bones could be counted from the back of his hand. When he pushed the dark green Hatian jade ring onto his thumb, it made his whole hand seem even more elegant and good-looking. It looked even better than when Xiao Bojian had worn it. When Xiao Hongyu saw that the thumb ring was now on Yichangdi's hand, he shook his head in pity and lamented, "Sister-in-law really has a good eye for things." He had no choice but to admit that this Hatian jade ring was perfect for Yichangdi, as if it had been tailor-made for him. Even Yichangdi himself lost track of his surroundings and stared at the ring for 2 entire seconds. After Xiao Hongyu turned and crawled back into his own bed, Yichangdi threw another wooden box at him. You can use this from now on. Xiao Hongyu's expression turned to joy after he opened the box. Inside it was the white jade thumb ring that Yichangdi had been using. He hugged the wooden box and broke out into a wide, foolish smile. Brother He, at least you have some conscience left in you. The Hatian jade ring was warm to the touch, a constant reminder of that wicked woman's existence. A little uncomfortable, Yichangdi rubbed at the thumb ring. Finally, he set his gaze on the other items in the package. Xiao Hongyu was playing with the white jade ring that Yichangdi had given him, so he was being very quiet. There wasn't much else in the package, just some sets of clothes that he usually wore. It was just enough to replace the 2 sets that he had ordered to be thrown away today. They were all inner clothing meant to be under armor. One of them was gray, and the other was indigo. He Sanling stroked the cloth with his slender fingers. He suddenly paused and looked closely at the indigo set of clothes. Chapter 351. Perfect Match 2. Despite the dimness of the tint, he was still able to see the patterns embroidered on the cloth. Male clothing usually had less embroidery than female clothing. However, on inner clothing like this, the sleeves and collar would still have some simple patterns sewn on. The most common were cloud lattices and geometric patterns. He Sanlang had once inadvertently heard Xian mentioning that Chu Lian's embroidery wasn't very good, so she hadn't been able to make any clothes for him. Xian had requested that he forgive Chu Lian for the lapse in her wifely duties. As he stroked the crooked square patterns on the collar of the indigo shirt, his cold face slowly shifted to a warm and gentle expression. He Changdi didn't say anything. He touched the clumsy embroidery again before taking it out and placing it carefully by his pillow, intending to wear it the next day. As for the gray clothing with more uniform embroidery, he rolled it up and wrapped it in the package before tossing it into his trunk of clothes. The army's supplies were also running low on lantern oil, so he Changdi put away the rest of the package's contents before blowing out the lamp and heading to bed. Some distance away in Liangzhou City, Chu Lian was still awake. After dinner, Manager Qin had come to report everything he had been able to find about Liangzhou City. He had also found a few middle-aged ladies to act as servants for her after thoroughly vetting them. Once Chu Lian had settled all of that, it was already late. Wanlan escorted Chu Lian back to her room, while Wenqing brought over a basin of hot water for her to soak her feet in. Chu Lian suddenly recalled that Wenqing had brought a huge package out to He Sanlang, so she casually asked, "Wenqing, what did you secretly give away to your third young master?" Wenqing knew that third young madam would ask her about the package sooner or later, so she didn't try to hide anything from Chu Lian. She replied honestly, "I gave third young master 2 sets of clothing and the jade thumb ring that third young madam bought from Jinshi Pavilion." Chu Lian was stunned for a moment. She hadn't expected Wenqing to give away the green jade ring on her behalf. She had mentioned it in front of her personal maidservants before, saying that she was intending to give one of the rings to her husband, He Changdi. However, she hadn't found the right time yet when the barbarian ambush came, and then there she had been busy with settling down in Liangzhou City's He estate, so she had completely forgotten about the thumb ring. Chu Lian wasn't bothered by Wenqing taking initiative. That thumb ring was meant for He Changdi anyway. It didn't matter how it was given to him. Chu Lian stopped thinking about the ring and asked, "Which 2 sets of clothes did you give him?" She had prepared plenty of things for this trip to the north. Matriarch He was also biased towards He Changdi, so she had prepared lots of food for him. Adding up Matriarch He's and her own contributions, Chu Lian had brought 3 whole trunks filled with things for He Sanlang alone. When Wenqing saw that third young madam didn't blame her for her actions, she brightened up and pointed at a red-painted trunk in the corner of the room. This servant took out 2 sets of inner clothes from that trunk there, 1 indigo and 1 gray. Chu Lian had been soaking her lily-white feet in the hot water. She was supposed to be relaxing, but upon hearing Wenqing's reply, she abruptly stiffened up. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Wenqing, why didn't you check the clothes when you took them out?" Wenqing didn't understand what third young madam meant. Aren't the clothes in that trunk the ones that the matriarch prepared for third young master? This servant was in a rush, so this servant placed the clothes in the package without checking. Chu Lian couldn't hold back the urge to laugh any longer. "There's a set of clothing in there that you embroidered. Don't you remember?" Chu Lian had a good memory, so she clearly remembered that the clothes Liu had embroidered were indigo in color. TL note: pictures after a long time. Just to help you imagine what the embroidery and clothes look like. Cloud lattice pattern simple 1, geometric pattern square geometric patterns guy wearing ancient undershirt/tunic. I use the word shirt, undershirt, tunic, and inner clothes to describe the clothes above carat. Chapter 352. Idea 1. On the way here to the north, they had been bored stiff while sitting in the carriage all day, so Wenqing and Wanlan had started doing some sewing and embroidery while traveling. The guard siblings that Princess Wei had sent followed Chu Lian all the time. Since Liu was female, Chu Lian would regularly invite her into the carriage to pass some time together. Liu had been training in martial arts ever since she was young, so her martial arts skills were even stronger than some of the generals out there. However, when it came to the more womanly arts, she was a complete stranger to them. She had already gotten engaged to her childhood sweetheart, so when she saw that Wenqing and Wanlan were so good at the womanly arts, she had gotten the urge to try her own hand at them. Chu Lian had then told Wenqing to give her one of He Changdi's tunics to practice on. Although Liu was very earnest at learning, her skills weren't very good still. It was just a simple square pattern, but she had somehow made it all crooked. Later on, She had completely given up on fighting against her natural talents and abandoned the art of the needle. Back then, Chu Lian had been absolutely stoked by the whole chain of events. She couldn't have expected that Li Yu's embroidery practice would inadvertently have been sent to Changdi. With how the mind of her lunatic husband worked, he couldn't possibly have thought that that crooked embroidery was done by her, right? Chu Lian resisted the urge to sigh as she thought. If that really happened, He Sanling would still be overestimating her. She didn't even know how to make a tunk, let alone embroidering some patterns. Hee. After Chu Lian reminded her about the incident, Wenqing recalled what had happened and slapped her own forehead. Third young madam, what should we do? She had been the one to teach Li Yu embroidery in the first place. To be honest, Li Yu's embroidery was a little ugly. In contrast to Wenqing's regret about the mistake, Chu Lian was calm. It's okay. Forget about it. It's just some embroidery. Anyway, your young master is a man and he's in the army. Who would look at the embroidery on his undershirts? It's good enough as long as he has clothes to wear. That indigo tunic had been ready-made anyway. It was just a simple piece of clothing with some loose threads. Although Li Yu's embroidery wasn't that good-looking, it didn't affect the undershirt's usability in any way. Wenqing was comforted by Chu Lian's words and stopped thinking about the mistake. After soaking her feet, Chu Lian laid down on the warm hearth bed. Wenqing blew out the lights for her and shut the door. However, Chu Lian stared at the dark ceiling above her head without any hint of sleepiness. Her head was filled with thoughts about the border army's supply problem. The original story had only briefly mentioned how fierce the battles had been in the Northern Border War. Of the 50,000 soldiers in the border troops, less than 10% of them had managed to survive the war. Since that was all that was mentioned, Chu Lian had no way of finding out more information. Right now, the biggest problem was the snow blocking the paths to the north. As long as the paths were clear, they would be able to bring supplies into the northern border, and there would be no more problems. However, there was no way they could control the weather. The Great Wu Dynasty wasn't like a technologically advanced civilization, unlike the modern world where they would still have the option of air freight if the routes on land and water were blocked. Up till her sleepiness got the better of her, Chu Lian still hadn't thought of any practical and useful methods to solve the issue. Back at the capital, the officials gathered for court were already arguing furiously over the situation at the northern border. Xiao Bojian had been appointed as secretary for the reinforcements marching towards the north and was now following the troops stationed at Chengzhou Prefecture as they made haste towards Sioux City. They were to make camp next to Lake Qianshan outside Sioux City and act as the first line of defense in the case that the fortress at Liangzhou City were to fall. Chapter 353, Idea 2. The next day, Chu Lian was heading to the center of the courtyard after getting up when she saw Li Xing and the other guards shoveling snow. In just a single night, the snow covering the ground had stacked up enough to reach their knees. The whole He estate had practically been buried in snow. Wenlan spotted Chu Lian coming out of her room and standing at the corridor just like that. So she quickly rushed into the room and took out her cloak. She helped Chu Lian into her cloak and stuffed a hand warmer into her hands. Third young madam, the wound on your leg has just healed. Please be careful not to get a chill, or third young master will blame this servant. Chu Lian glared at Wenlan in response. It snowed a lot last night. Wenlan also found it strange. She had grown up in the capital. Although it snowed in the capital every year as well, it had never snowed as much as it did here. That's right, third young madam. Last night, my sister and I came out to check the surroundings, and the amount of snow falling was enough to block our vision completely. If we were to go out on such a snowy day, wouldn't we get buried by the snow? Chu Lian turned to look in the direction of the border camp with worry filling her heart. She wondered how the border troops were doing now. Where's Manager Qin? In the outer court. He's probably taking care of the carriage horses we brought with us. It snowed so much last night that the stables collapsed. 2 of the horses froze to death. Have someone bring him to me. I have some tasks for him. Wenlan quickly went to do as ordered. Chu Lian stood in front of her room door and watched as the estate's guards shoveled snow. The heap of snow that they cleared was as tall as a small hill. It took the 5 men an hour before they managed to clear the snow that had piled up in Chu Lian's small courtyard. After 20 minutes or so, Manager Qin rushed over from the outer court. The He estate was quite large, and there were 5 small courtyards within. They couldn't clear all the snow in the estate so quickly, so Manager Qin had designated Chu Lian's courtyard as the first to be cleared out. They would only start on the outer court after Chu Lian's courtyard had been completely cleared, so the paths in the outer court hadn't been cleared yet. As Chu Lian stood in the corridor, she watched as Manager Qin, who was wrapped up until he looked like a ball, waddled into her courtyard. Manager Qin had seen Chu Lian standing at the door from afar. Before he entered the courtyard, he shouted while gasping for breath, "Third young madam, it's cold outside. Please enter the room first. I'm walking rather slowly." Of course he was walking slowly. He had tied 2 wooden boards onto his feet. Chu Lian didn't speak and simply smiled at him. When her gaze landed on Manager Qin's feet, she abruptly fell into a daze. Her almond-shaped eyes were obscured by haze, as if she had suddenly sunk deeply into her own thoughts. Manager Qin found it strange. He looked down at his own feet and the boots that he had tied wooden boards to. It didn't seem like anything was wrong. He struggled as he fought with the snow and finally entered the courtyard. When he finally reached the cobblestone path that had been cleared of snow, he let out a sigh of relief. He bent down and took off the wooden boards tied to his boots. He stomped his feet to clear the snow stuck to his boots before taking a brisk pace as he walked towards Chu Lian, freed of his burden. Chu Lian's gaze was still fixed on the wooden boards that Manager Qin had set down not too far away. Manager Qin followed her gaze and looked at the boards as well. Those were just 2 normal pieces of willow wood. There were still quite a few placed in the storehouses of the estate that had been left abandoned for years. There didn't seem to be anything special about them. However, since Chu Lian seemed to be interested in them, Manager Qin explained as he walked towards her. "Third young madam, that was something that the old servants of the estate taught me. They said that it would be easier to walk with the wooden boards tied to your feet and you wouldn't fall into the snow. I followed exactly as they said, and it actually worked pretty well. I did have to use more strength while walking, but I didn't have to worry about falling into a deep pile of snow and freezing my legs off." When Manager Qin turned back to look at his young mistress, he found that her almond-shaped eyes were lit up and sparkling. In the next second, Chu Lian stamped her feet excitedly and said, "I was so stupid. Why didn't I think of such a simple method?" After blurting that out, she completely forgot about Manager Qin and rushed back into the room. Manager Qin continued standing in the corridor with one hand stretched out and a dazed expression on his face. He didn't know what had gotten into his mistress. When Wenqing came out of the side room and saw that he was still standing in the same spot with a silly look on his face, she didn't know what to do either. "Manager Qin, come into the side hall and take a seat first. There's hot water on the stove too. I'm going into the room to see what happened to third young madam." Manager Qin waved his hand at Wenqing. "Please go, quickly." That excited expression on third young madam's face had been a little frightening. After he had been informed bright and early that morning that the stables had collapsed, he was now rather cautious and careful about protecting his mistress. TL note: Manager Qin's expression was literally described as Erkong's dazed expression for my fair princess, which made me LOL. He's calling out for his soon-to-be wife, Ziwei, in this shot. Ziwei, My Fair Princess is an old TV drama about a long-lost princess called Ziwei trying to reconnect with her father, the emperor. Of course, through some shenanigans, a young commoner girl, Zyro Yanzi, got caught up in the mess and she now has to pretend to be the long-lost princess herself or lose her head. The drama shows what it was like to live in the palace and lots of funny dramatic scenes. I watched it as a little kid and absolutely loved it. Zyro Yanzi was my favorite character. Erkong is one of the male leads in it 2XD if you've heard of Fan Bingbing, who acted as Blink in X-Men. Days of Future Past, she played a faithful servant in the drama and became famous because of this drama. I really recommend watching My Fair Princess for a cool look into ancient Chinese customs and also for a really cute and funny female lead. Chapter 354, Dissatisfaction 1. When Wenqing pushed open the doors and entered the room, she saw Chu Lian sitting in front of the desk with her head slightly bent forward. She was using some black eyebrow dye to draw on some paper. She walked over as soundlessly as she could and stood to one side. She looked at the paper, but she couldn't tell what Chu Lian was drawing at all. There were even strange symbols marked on the paper here and there. Before Wenqing could ask, Chu Lian spoke up first. Quick, tell Manager Qin to find the best carpenter in Liangzhou City and bring him here. Quickly. Chu Lian's tone was so firm that Wenqing couldn't help but treat it as a very serious matter. She had absolute trust in her third young madam. As absurd as Chu Lian's actions might look to others sometimes, Wenqing would never doubt her mistress. After experiencing the power of her young madam's ideas so many times, Wenqing had already become a loyal fan of Chu Lian's. Third young madam, rest assured. This servant will go and look for Manager Qin right now. After Manager Qin had been given his orders, although he found it rather strange as well, he set to work immediately. Manager Qin was quite capable. In just half a day, he managed to find the best carpenter in Liangzhou City and invited him to the He estate. Just as they entered the estate, they bumped into the leader of the He family soldiers, Imo Chungue. Imo Chungue was dressed in just a single layer of clothing. He was drenched in sweat from shoveling snow, even to the point that his hair seemed to be giving off steam. The private soldiers behind him were all panting for breath as well. When Imo Chungue looked up, what he saw was Manager Qin leading an old man in with a bright smile on his face which looked almost ingratiating. Imo Chungue was a stubborn man who had no forbearance for anything. He was already biased against Chu Lian, so he never had anything nice to say to Chu Lian's subordinate, Manager Qin. Normally, the two of them would mind their own business, somewhat keeping the peace in the estate. However, Imo Chungue wasn't going to let him off so easily today. Everyone in the estate had been put to shoveling snow. Even the two guard siblings from Chu Lian's courtyard, Li Xing and Li Yu, hadn't been exempt. However, look at this Manager Qin. It was fine if he didn't help out, but he had even gone out early in the morning for some idle walk. Now he was bringing back some stranger to the estate. Imo Chungue shot a glance at Manager Qin from the corners of his eyes. He spoke with a mocking tone. While everyone in the estate is working so hard, Manager Qin seems to have plenty of free time. Even the knee-high snow isn't enough to stop your feet from wandering out. Manager Qin didn't have the time to argue with Imo Chungue. He bowed towards Imo Chungue before quickly leading the carpenter towards Chu Lian's courtyard. Imo Chungue's wrinkled old face turned dark with anger. Look at what a good dog he is. The private soldiers next to him kept silent, afraid that they would accidentally spark the temper of their volatile old brother. After getting ignored by Manager Qin, Imo Chungue couldn't hold down the frustration in his heart. He spit on the ground before saying, "Send someone to see what kind of trouble third young madam is trying to cause now." One of the soldiers acknowledged the order and left. When Manager Qin led the carpenter into the courtyard, Chu Lian was already seated in the parlor with some papers in hand. Manager Qin was very reliable when it came to business. Although the carpenter he had found wasn't literate, when Chu Lian explained her blueprints to him, he immediately understood. He was really the best in the woodworking business around here after all. The old carpenter examined the 3 blueprints, each with a different view of the design, for about 15 minutes before knowing exactly what he had to do. "Old master, how fast can you make this?" Chu Lian asked impatiently. The old carpenter looked at the blueprints in his hands for a moment before speaking. "Esteemed madam, this old man has never done anything like this after living for so long. This old man will speak to you honestly. If this old man were to do it alone, it would take at least 5 days. If you would allow this old man to bring in this old man's sons and grandsons to help, then it can be done in about 2 to 3 days. Chapter 354, Dissatisfaction 2. Chu Lian looked carefully at the old carpenter. Although his face was already wrinkled, his eyes weren't hazy or unfocused in the slightest. On the contrary, they were bright and filled with intelligence. She laughed in response. "Old master has indeed lived much longer than I have. I can agree to your conditions, but I have a condition of my own. If this design were to leak out without my express permission, then we won't be standing here having a nice discussion like we are today." The old carpenter's eyes lit up. He held tightly onto the blueprints and immediately knelt down before Chu Lian. He kowtowed twice to her, making resounding thuds on the floor. If this old man were to act against esteemed madam's wishes, then this old man will die without any heirs. The ancients placed a lot of importance on passing on their legacies. They were also rather superstitious and revered the gods. Chu Lian wasn't too worried now that the old carpenter had made such a solemn vow. Old master, I'm entrusting this to you. You can bring any number of helpers you want. I'm only giving you 3 days. In 3 days, I want to see that design built. This old man won't betray esteemed madam's expectations. Chu Lian turned to instruct Manager Qin. Manager Qin, you are to arrange for anything that old master needs as soon as possible. Manager Qin was very efficient with his work, so he immediately pulled the old carpenter over to one of the side rooms to discuss what was needed. Thus, before it was even midday, the old carpenter had already started work. Manager Qin sent someone to bring the old carpenter's 3 sons and eldest grandson into the estate. Chu Lian's courtyard wasn't very big in the first place, so the sudden increase in the number of people coming to and fro from her courtyard was very eye-catching. Due to the absolute secrecy of the blueprints, Chu Lian had arranged for the old carpenter and his family to work in one of the empty storehouses on the side of the courtyard, and for the Li siblings to take turns guarding the storehouse. The entire He estate was startled by how serious Chu Lian was treating her little project. Even Tang Yin sent over someone to inquire about what she was doing, only to be sent back with some excuse. All of this made Imo Chungue very unhappy. While Chu Lian had been able to deflect Tang Yin, Imo Chungue wasn't one to back down so easily. It snowed heavily the next few days. The streets of Liangzhou City were practically buried by the snowfall, so it became even harder to travel out of the estate. Imo Chungue sent some men to check on the situation at the border camp early in the morning. When his men returned and reported on what they had found, Imo Chungue frowned and shook his head silently. They were all old and grizzled soldiers who had fought on countless battlefields, so they knew that the situation was taking a turn for the worse. Imo Chungue had gotten a good overview of the border troop situation from Changdi, but he couldn't do anything but sit and wait anxiously. These few days, due to his worries and stress, he had even gotten 2 large blisters at the corner of his mouth. Since he was biased against Chu Lian, he had never eaten the meals that Chu Lian sent over. Even though the food was fragrant and looked extremely delicious, he never took a single bite. He would order his men to send all the meals back unopened. Not only that, he never allowed his soldiers to eat those meals either. Chu Lian had only sent meals over out of basic courtesy in the first place. After getting rejected by Imo Chungue, she got the hint and stopped sending food over. Up till now, Chu Lian's party had been eating dishes made out of dried vegetables for at least a few days every week. Thanks to the good nutritional balance of their meals, their faces were glowing with the pink of health. However, it was a whole other story for the private soldiers under Imo Chungue's command. Since they weren't eating the meals cooked by Chu Lian's party, all they ate every day was the dry and hard wheat pancakes made by the border camp's cooks. Occasionally, they would be able to have a bowl of thin gruel and a piece of salted meat. As more time passed, their faces became more and more sallow and their health became poorer. Whenever the private soldiers went out of the estate with Chu Lian's subordinates, they looked like they had come from completely different places. By this time, the men that Imo Chungue had sent to spy on Chu Lian had also returned. Imo Chungue sat at the head of the room and asked the old soldier who had gone to check on Chu Lian, "What is third young madam doing now?" Chapter 356. Chu Lian loses her temper. 1. The old soldier shook his head awkwardly. It was hard for him to admit he hadn't been able to find out what Chu Lian was up to. That small courtyard of hers was now bustling with activity, and there were people hauling wooden planks in and out all the time. Although the old soldier was unable to come up with any words to report, Imo Chungue was able to understand the meaning behind his silence. He had already been simmering with anger towards Chu Lian before this. This strange new activity of hers was the last bit of fuel that sent his temper rocketing sky high. He slammed his palm on the table, making the porcelain teacups on it clatter as they trembled from the force. Is third young madam completely ignoring our presence? Back then, he hadn't been very approving of the matriarch sending third young madam here to the north. She was just a little girl, barely come of age, who was probably used to being spoiled all day and night. What would she be able to achieve out here? Just look at what she had done on the way here. She had been sent here to help third young master, but her actions said otherwise. She had clearly come out to sightsee on her personal leisure trip, but at public expense. The moment she had arrived at the northern border, she had already caused trouble for third young master, and he had been punished by martial law. Imo Chungue had been held back by He Changdi's orders previously. Even though he was extremely unhappy with Chu Lian, he had suppressed his anger towards her and hadn't done anything. They had each minded their own business. However, this sudden snowstorm was like the last piece of straw that broke the camel's back. All of the negative emotions within Imo Chungue had accumulated to a point where he could no longer suppress them. Right now, he felt like a volcano about to explode. These 2 days, the first thing that Chu Lian did every morning after waking up was to visit the old carpenter in the storehouse and check on the progress of her project. Although the old carpenter was a little too shrewd, he was an utmost professional and skilled at his craft. After making a promise to Chu Lian, he had devoted his heart to his work. After working with his sons and grandsons for 2 days and 2 nights, Chu Lian's project was almost complete. The old carpenter had started working before the sun had even risen. When he heard the door opening, he knew that it was Chu Lian who had come to visit. Every day at this hour, the esteemed madam would come over personally to take a look at his progress. He set down the woodworking plane in his hands and hurried over to welcome her. This old man gives greetings to esteemed madam. Chu Lian waved her hand and asked, "Old master, will you be able to finish your work today?" When it came to the topic of woodworking, the old carpenter's originally bent back immediately straightened up with pride. He focused his gaze at the object placed in the center of the storehouse as if he were looking at a child he had raised. "Esteemed madam, please don't worry. This old man is as good as his word. This old man will be able to finish this before night falls." Chu Lian moved a little closer to the object. The old carpenter was right. It looked exactly like the object she had drawn out in her blueprints. She glanced at the rest of the storehouse and noticed that the old carpenter's sons and grandsons were standing respectfully to one side. She found it strange and spoke up, "You don't have to care about my presence here. Please be at ease and continue your work." The old carpenter let out an unabashed bark of laughter that was as honest as the man it had come from. "Esteemed madam, these kids aren't purposely standing around because of you. We've used up all the wood we had, so Master Qin went out early in the morning to buy more. This old man's just waiting for the materials. Once Master Qin returns, we'll be able to finish our work in just 1 hour." Although Chu Lian knew what the rough design should be, she wasn't very sure about the kind of materials she should use for it, since it was her first time making something like this. After discussing with the old carpenter, she had decided on using fir wood, which was harder and more robust. After testing their first prototype, they wouldn't have to be so rigid with the choice of materials later on. Chu Lian nodded and left the storehouse. Once she reached the entrance, she ordered Wanlan to send the old carpenter and his helpers something nice to eat. Chapter 357. Chu Lian loses her temper, 2. After a short moment, the old carpenter and his workers sat on the floor together with a large bowl of vegetable porridge each. They gulped down the porridge as if they hadn't eaten in days. The spark of shrewdness that the old carpenter had shown during his negotiations with Chu Lian had completely disappeared in the face of delicious food. His sons and grandsons were acting just the same as the old carpenter. They buried their heads in their bowls, only looking up once the bowl was emptied. After eating up all of his vegetable porridge and gulping down some extra cabbage and meat buns, the old carpenter wiped his mouth on his sleeve with utmost satisfaction. He sighed with deep feeling. Heavens! Having vegetables to eat on a winter day, let alone such fresh and juicy green vegetables, was nothing short of a miracle. On the first morning, when he had been given such amazing food for breakfast, the old carpenter had been frightened half to death. Green vegetables in the middle of a harsh winter. Surely even the emperor wouldn't be able to have much better food than this. The old carpenter mulled over his thoughts. Furthermore, there seemed to be something added to this vegetable porridge that made it taste absolutely fresh. He lamented the fact that he couldn't just have 3 heaping bowls of this for every meal. Whenever the old servant who brought their meals came to take the bowls away, the bowls used by the old carpenter's family were always gleaming. She hardly had to wash them after taking them back to the kitchen. When Chu Lian returned to her room, She sat on the hearth absent-mindedly. From time to time, she would send Winching and Wanlon out to check if Manager Qin had returned. Winching found it strange, but she took her task even more seriously. No matter how bad the situation, their third young madam had always been able to keep a smile on her face. This was the first time she had seen such an anxious and worried expression on her mistress. Unfortunately, this time, Chu Lian's worst fears came true. After 1 hour had passed, Li Xing hurriedly rushed in to report. Honored lady, Manager Qin and the others have been taken to another courtyard by old Emma. Chu Lian frowned and ordered Wanlon to help her up from the hearth bed. She announced with a solemn expression, "Let's go there quickly." With a grave expression on her face and additional shadows in her bright eyes, she actually looked a little more like He Sanling. In the side courtyard of the He estate, Manager Qin and his men had been forced to kneel on the snow-covered ground. The old soldiers were skilled in martial arts, so Manager Qin and the other manservants didn't have any chance against them. Imo Chungue stood in the corridor facing the yard and stared with cold eyes at Manager Qin. He shouted with disappointment, "Third young madam is just a little girl, so it's fine if she doesn't know better. However, you, as her loyal servant, how could you let her act so frivolously without persuading otherwise? While you were acting so recklessly in this estate, did you give any thought to how the commoners and soldiers outside are faring?" Manager Qin's mouth had been stuffed with a piece of cloth, and his hands were tied behind his bed. His slightly plump face was flushed red with effort as he tried to speak and explain, but he just couldn't make any sound. Imo Chungue harumphed. When he cast his gaze at the good-quality fur wood piled up at the side, his temper flared up once again. Fir wood. That type of wood was expensive everywhere. In Liangzhou City, where they couldn't even use money, it was likely bought back by exchanging huge amounts of material goods. These few days, he and the other soldiers had been trying their best to eat less and save up what they could. However, on the other hand, third young madam had taken their food supplies and gone out to spend it lavishly on some useless materials. Imo Chingue's temper was burning high in his heart. He stared coldly at the dogs acting for third young madam and spoke sinisterly. "Third young madam is of the weaker sex, so she probably can't bear to use bloodier measures. Since the matriarch gave orders for me to protect third young madam on this journey, then I'll take action on behalf of third young madam today to punish these infidels. Men, reward him with 50 strikes of the rod." Once Imo Chengue gave the order, 2 old soldiers pushed Manager Qin to the ground and pulled away the fur cloak he had wrapped around him. The soldiers were each carrying large wooden rods thicker than their arms. They raised them high up in the air and prepared to aim them at Manager Qin's body. Imo Chengue had retired from the army, but he still kept the habit of using the military style of punishment. Without even giving the other party a chance to defend himself, he had immediately decided the punishment of 50 strikes. Even the strongest elite soldiers wouldn't be able to withstand 50 strikes of the rod, let alone Manager Qin, who wasn't trained in any martial arts at all. He was clearly trying to sentence Manager Qin to death. The first rod landed on Manager Qin with a muffled thump thanks to the protection of his thick winter clothing. Although Manager Qin didn't seem to react much, he actually wanted to shout in pain. Unfortunately, his mouth was covered so he couldn't make any sound apart from a stifled grunt. Before the next rod could land, an enraged shout carried over from the entrance of the courtyard. "Stop right now." TL note. Just some simple but heartwarming fare. Imagine eating something warm and soft in winter and having it sit nicely in your tummy. Dried vegetable porridge buns with meat and vegetable filling. Chapter 358. Chu Lian loses her temper. 3. This story is completely free to read on Valera Novels. If you're reading this on another site, this content has been illegally stolen. Please support my translations on the original source. Imo Chingue hadn't expected Chu Lian to have come over so quickly. However, he had already set his heart on punishing her subordinate to give her a warning today. He simply frowned without any intention of calling off the punishment. Others might be afraid of third young madam's power and influence, but he wasn't afraid. He had already experienced countless battles as a soldier. It was already a blessing from the heavens to have survived battle after battle with his life intact. Although his family was already gone, He had pledged his loyalty to old Count Jingen and his house. His life and death were no longer of any consequence. If he could make the young and naive third young madam wake up with this show of military punishment today, it wouldn't matter even if she demanded his life in return. The old soldiers carrying out the punishment froze. However, Mo Chungu waved his hand and ordered, "Continue the punishment. No one is allowed to stop unless I say so. Anyone who disobeys this order will serve the same punishment themselves." Although they were old comrades in arms, everyone understood Mo Chingue's temper. They knew that the old fellow was dead set on his path and wouldn't change for anything. Hearing this, Chu Lian was similarly straightforward in her actions. She shot a look at the Li siblings behind her. Li Xing and Li Yu had been sent by Princess Wei, so they naturally only listened to Chu Lian's commands. The Li siblings quickly captured the two soldiers. Mo Chingue watched with wide, angry eyes as his two subordinates were subdued by Li Xing and Li Yu. He ran forward and picked up one of the rods on the floor, intending to carry out the punishment himself. Chu Lian's expression tensed and she sneered, "Uncle Mo, if you let that rod land, there'll be no more hope for the border troops." When Mo Chungue heard Chu Lian's words, his features contorted into a wretched expression. He was a retired soldier, so he could never bear to hear anyone talk bad about the army. Those words were like a curse upon the border troops, dooming them to defeat. He abruptly stopped his actions and rushed towards Chu Lian instead. "Third young madam, you can't be careless with your words." Chu Lian's sneer was as frosty as her tone. "Oh, I'm not allowed to speak carelessly? Then how is it that Uncle Mo is allowed to beat others indiscriminately?" Mo Chingue's face turned as black as a pot. "Third young madam, this treasonous servant used valuable food supplies to buy these useless pieces of wood. Why shouldn't he be punished? Or are you saying that he's an exception to the rule just because he's your subordinate?" Seeing that Manager Qin hadn't been harmed too badly, Chu Lian had slowly calmed down. She turned her bright and clear gaze on Mo Chungue. There wasn't any trace of a smile on her porcelain-like face. "Fine. You said that he deserves to be beaten. Then let me ask you, Uncle Mo, since you're so worried for the border troops, have you thought of an idea to save them and help those 50,000 warriors out of the situation they're in?" Mo Chingue hadn't expected Chu Lian to throw such a question at him at this time. What a joke. If he had thought of a good idea, would he still be staying in this tiny HE estate? He would have sprinted over to the border camp to share his plans with third young master by now. He wasn't the only one trying to think of a solution either. Even those highly regarded officials and court back at the capital hadn't been able to come up with a good idea. What kind of ideas could a rough military man like him have? Third young madam was clearly just trying to put him on the spot and make things difficult for him. This third young madam had nothing good about her except being a glutton and being protective over her own people. TL note: I think the first part of this chapter has already shown you Mo Chingue's perspective and the reasons behind his actions. I'll add on some information that might help paint a better picture of the ancient China setting here. There are two ways to become a servant. Sell yourself / be sold into eternal servitude or be born to a servant. The masters hold a bond certificate which represents the servant's freedom as a person, and this is why servants usually don't run away. This is also why servants are treated as less than human or disposable, or tradable in the case of Ming Yan. Matriarch he trusted the servants in Gillen restaurant with managing the money because she likely has the rest of their families in her hands. Manager Qin is a servant born within House Jingen. Mo Chungue was a soldier who served under old Count Jingen and proved himself enough to earn his trust. So Mo Chungue is a free person working in an influential position in House Jingen, while Manager Qin is just a slave of House Jingen. Mo Chungue honestly thought that Manager Qin was wasting precious resources, and it is well within his power to punish a servant, even to death. Mo Chungue is also considered to be in the same generation as old Count Jingen, who is 2 generations above Chu Lian. Mo Chungue is a very senior person and used to being obeyed in the military. Chu Lian is a sheltered young teenager to him, and she has also been calling him Uncle Mo in deference to his seniority and position. He is also fiercely loyal to the old Count, and his mindset is likely to help guide the next generation and make sure that House Jingen won't go into ruin. I think you also have to keep in mind his age and how stubborn old men can be. Phew, That was a long note. I know that some of you are frustrated by the seemingly irrational actions of the characters, so I wanted to try to add more context to help you understand them if possible. This novel was written for a Chinese audience and comes with many unwritten rules of ancient Chinese society that shape how the characters act. I just wanted to make sure you guys get that information as well, and that you might be able to see the characters in a different light. Of course, if you still think that the characters' actions don't make sense, feel free to voice it out in the comments. 3. Chapter 359. Chu Lian loses her temper. 4. Mo Chingue's disdain for her only grew. He stood ramrod straight with his chest pushed forward and his chin raised. Third young madam, are you joking with me? An idea? I really do have to ask for your pardon, third young madam. I'm just a simple boor without any magic powers. The mockery in his tone was so thick and infuriating that Wenqing and Wanlan lost their patience. They glared at Mo Chingue with anger. If not for Chu Lian holding them back, the two ladies would have started fighting with Mo Chingue on the spot. He snorted in response. Humph. Third young madam's subordinates are really united. Huh? Did you bribe them with your food? Chu Lian really didn't understand how this fellow's mind worked. He couldn't think of a solution on his own, so he had decided that everyone else was just as stupid as he was. Who knew if it was due to his unwarranted self-confidence or because he thought too highly of himself? If all the soldiers in the army shared the same level of wit as this guy, then the Great Wu dynasty should just throw down their weapons and admit defeat. While Chu Lian normally looked like a young, soft, warm, and gentle lady, anyone who assumed that she was an easy target to bully would be the first to face defeat. She wasn't the kind to leave grudges to fester overnight. That was because she would take revenge on the spot the moment anyone dared to bully her. Mo Chingue had already crossed the line. Chu Lian had no more patience and tolerance left for him. As Wenqing and Wanlan stood behind their third young madam, they noticed that her eyes were shining brightly and her pink lips were drawn up into a smirk despite her grave expression. Although their mistress clearly looked even more vibrant and livelier than normal, the two maidservants shivered in unison. Mo Chingue was doomed. Third young madam was really angry this time. Wenqing and Wanlan exchanged looks with their eyes twitching. They must have been brain-dead just now to think that third young madam would be bullied. It would be considered a good day if third young madam didn't bully someone. Mo Chingue, I really don't know what grandfather saw in you to make you one of House Jing'an's family soldiers. You're so blinded by your own presumptuous self-conceit. Why haven't you ascended yet? She no longer called him Uncle Mo out of respect for his age and changed to calling his full name directly. Chu Lian had been holding down her discontent for so long that she felt refreshed upon letting loose her tirade. However, Mo Chingue and the others in the courtyard were all stiff with shock. They directed similar expressions of disbelief at Chu Lian and gulped in unorchestrated unison. They trembled as they thought inwardly, Third young madam was scolding Leader Mo? Although third young madam was so young, her daring knew no bounds. Even the heir's wife wouldn't dare to scold Leader Mo right to his face like that. For some reason, although they knew that third young madam's straightforward and bold approach wasn't right either, they still felt a mysterious sense of satisfaction. Everyone stood by silently without moving, hiding their intentions of watching the drama unfold. Mo Chingue had clearly been dealt a blow by Chu Lian's words. He opened his eyes wide and glared right back at her. Although he had never heard the word ascended being used to scold others, he could tell that it didn't mean anything good from her tone. Mo Chingue was just a boorish man to the core. He was the best at using his fists, not his tongue. Before he was able to retort, Chu Lian continued her tirade. Mo Chingue, let me tell you this now. Anything that is impossible to you becomes a real possibility in my hands. Don't use that narrow-minded gaze of yours to judge others. Just because you can't do it doesn't mean that others can't do it too. I'll reveal a little more to you. These useless pieces of fur might not even be worth a wheat pancake to you, but they're going to do what you couldn't do and save those 50,000 soldiers. Leaving behind her words, Chu Lian turned and left. Tang Yin, who had been standing right outside the courtyard for some time, had heard her. She trusted that he would be able to take care of the rest. Actually, Imo Chungue wasn't as bad as Chu Lian made him out to be. He was just too stubborn and didn't know how to adapt to new changes. She believed that her words would be enough to wake him up and prevent him from becoming an obstacle on their northern journey. Chu Lian left just as quickly as she had come, like a breeze. However, this wasn't a gentle and refreshing breeze. It was a fearsome hurricane that had completely bowled over everyone present in the courtyard. Imo Chungue was so stunned by the whole chain of events that all the nerves in his body seemed to be frozen. He couldn't move at all. Chapter 360. Shutout 1. Had he been hallucinating? What had third young madam said just now? Did she say that she had a way to help the border troops out of their dangerous situation? Imo Chungue stood there dazed for 20 whole seconds before the haziness in his eyes cleared up and he seemed to come back to life. He looked around the courtyard in panic, but Chu Lian's figure had long since disappeared. He roared in agitation. "Where is third young madam?" The old soldiers who had been carrying out Manager Chin's punishment were stricken with terror. Although they were already getting on in age, their hearing was still working fine. They had heard third young madam's words just now. Manager Chin had gone out to find these pieces of fir wood for the sake of saving the 50,000 border troops. However, they had not only blamed him unjustly for his actions, but they had almost beaten him to death. When they thought of what they had almost wrought, cold sweat ran down their backs in the middle of the cold winter day. The soldiers stared at Imo Chungue with condemning gazes. "Brother Imo, third young madam is already gone." Imo Chungue ran after her without thinking. Although he didn't quite dare to trust in her yet, since Chu Lian had spoken, that meant that there was hope. Even though he couldn't think of how those pieces of fir wood would be able to save the troops. The people of the Great Wu dynasty placed great emphasis on keeping to one's word. This wasn't the modern era where even the most binding contracts could be broken. This was an era where a promise was worth 1,000 taels of gold. All families, no matter their size or influence, would keep promises made by their ancestors for generations upon generations. Thus, when Chu Lian made her outrageous claim in front of Imo Chungue, he didn't have an ounce of suspicion that she was spinning up a story. Since she had spoken those words, then there was definitely some hope. It was indeed so. The old carpenter had already finished building Chu Lian's idea. It was just a matter of time before they were able to put it to use. At this moment, Imo Chungue had instantly forgotten all the disdain he had for Chu Lian. He chased right after her without any shame. When the old soldiers saw their leader Imo acting so shamelessly, they wanted to pretend that they didn't know him at all. This was entirely different from what they had imagined would happen at the start. "Oh, great leader, shouldn't you be scolding her right back with anger and arrogance?" Imo Chungue ran off quickly, leaving a huge mess behind him. Manager Chin and the manservants were still tied up, and there was still a pile of fir wood at the side. One of the old soldiers hurriedly ran off to ask about what they were supposed to do. Imo Chungue then ordered them to untie Manager Chin and to help them send the fir wood to Chu Lian's courtyard. Tang Yin stood at the entrance of the side courtyard with his guards. When he heard what was going on, he shook his head. Even he had been frightened by Chu Lian's words just now. He had thought to come out to mediate at first, but who knew that the whole scene would come to such a dramatic end? Honored Lady Jeannie was really full of surprises. "Sir, will you step into this matter?" One of the guards next to Tang Yin inquired. Tang Yin shook his head with a smile. "This matter has already been settled. Didn't you hear? Honored Lady has already found a solution. Come on, let's go and take a look." Tang Yin turned and started walking towards Chu Lian's courtyard as well. When he reached the entrance, he was met with the sight of Imo Chungue being blocked from entering the courtyard. When he saw the old soldier pacing back and forth at the entrance without care for the feather-sized snow falling from the sky, Tang Yin hesitated before going up to him. "Leader Imo, why are you standing out here? Why don't you go in and take a look?" Leader Imo hated literary officials like Tang Yin the most. After glaring at him, he continued pacing with his hands behind his back. Tang Yin didn't mind the frostiness from the old soldier. He turned towards the entrance and was about to stride right in when Li Xing used a sword to block his path. "Sir Tang, please stop right there. Honored Lady has given us instructions to prevent anyone from entering apart from the people who work in this courtyard." Chapter 361. Shut Out 2. Tang Yin hadn't thought that he would be blocked from entering as well. He ended up standing right next to Imo Chungue in the corridor. Tang Yin shook his head helplessly and turned to Imo Chungue. He complained, "Leader Imo, I've been dragged down by you." Imo Chungue had no desire whatsoever to acknowledge a literary official who was just a weak chicken in his eyes. He simply harumphed. Tang Yin wasn't deterred by the cold response and said, "Li Xing, see here. I'm not Leader Imo, and I didn't argue with your mistress. Why can't you let me in?" "Sir, please don't make it difficult for this subordinate. This subordinate is simply following Honored Lady's orders. Honored Lady said that this matter is top secret. Even when it's finished, she won't be able to give you a demonstration. The first priority is to send it to the border camp." Fine. He was dealing with another stick in the mud. Tang Yin finally gave up on trying to enter. His heart was itching with curiosity, and he really wanted to know what miracle Chu Lian had somehow come up with to save 50,000 border troops. However, since she wasn't willing to divulge the secret to him, he had no other choice. Tang Yin immediately turned around and left. He wasn't going to stand there in the cold wind and snow like that silly Imo Chungue. On the way back to his own courtyard, Tang Yin was still trying to guess at what Chu Lian's solution was. What kind of magic powers did that Chu Lian have? Why was it that every single person by her side was so loyal to her? Even the guards from Prince Wei's estate, Li Xing and Li Yu, were already treating her like their real master. Could it be due to her foodie ways? As expected, foodies were full of potential. Tang Yin was shamelessly disregarding how he had taken every chance he could to take a meal over at Chu Lian's courtyard. During the past few days of heavy snowfall, he had constantly been sending guards over to check on what Chu Lian was eating in her courtyard. Once the old carpenter had the rest of the materials in hand, he was able to work fast. They had already planned out the designs. Before actually starting the project, they had also made prototypes. Even so, they wasted a portion of the wood that had been gathered while working. Now on the brink of finishing, their materials fell short. They still needed one last plank. Chu Lian had been watching from the side this whole time. The old carpenter stopped working and hurried over to Chu Lian a little anxiously. "Esteemed madam, we're still lacking one more piece of wood. It was all this old man's fault for having such clumsy skills. We wasted some of the wood earlier." Chu Lian looked at the project. It did indeed look like it was nearly finished, so she sent the orders down to her subordinates. Wenqing quickly ran out to inform Manager Qin. Manager Qin had only gotten hit once with the rod, so he could bear with the pain in his buttocks. However, he could only stand and he wasn't able to sit. It would take a few days for him to recover enough to sit and lay on his back. When he saw Wenqing rushing out of the workroom, he moved forward to meet her. "What's wrong? Are we lacking something?" Wenqing sighed. "We just need one more piece of fir wood. Why didn't you buy just one more this morning?" Manager Qin sighed bitterly. It really wasn't because he hadn't bought enough materials. He had been captured by Imo Chungue while on the way back, and Imo Chungue had burned some of it as firewood. If not for him struggling and shouting that the fir wood was expensive, they might not have even had what they did. However, it wasn't the time to explain this to Wenqing. "Ask third young madam to wait a little longer. I'll go out right now and look for more fir. Rest assured, I'll definitely bring the remaining materials to third young madam today." "All right, go quickly. I'll pass your words on to third young madam." Manager Qin rubbed his backside gingerly and hobbled towards the courtyard entrance. He cursed and swore at Imo Chungue hundreds and thousands of times over in his heart. When he reached the entrance and looked up, only to see the man he had been cursing at, Manager Qin was so frightened he almost fell onto the ground. Once he could see the man's face clearly, Manager Qin spat on the ground and mumbled angrily under his breath, "How unlucky." Although Imo Chungue found it awkward as well, he still reached out to help Manager Qin find his feet before asking anxiously, "Manager Qin, how is that thing that third young madam is building? I definitely won't interfere or leak any information. Could you let me in to look at it?" Manager Qin snatched his arm back in a cold manner before sending a side-eyed glance at Imo Chungue. Then, he said, "Thanks to Leader Mo's heroic actions, we're now short on fur wood, so we can't complete the project. This humble one is about to go out and search for more." Chapter 362, Snowboat 1. What? They were lacking one more piece of fir wood? Leader Imo was filled with regret as he remembered the pieces of wood he had carelessly burned earlier. When he looked at how Manager Chin was hobbling away while holding onto his behind, he felt even more anxious. At this rate, wouldn't he take too long to find more fir wood? Imo Chungue followed closely behind Manager Chin and said, "Manager Chin, you're injured, so leave this matter to me." Manager Chin looked him up and down and snorted in his heart. This Imo Chungue was making his two-faced act so obvious that he felt irritated just looking at him. "If you want to go, then go ahead. I'm not holding you back. However, since this is something that third young madam has ordered me to do, I have to do my best to complete my task no matter what." After saying so, Manager Chin tossed his sleeves and hurried away while bearing with the pain from his injury, completely ignoring Imo Chungue. Imo Chungue knew that he had gone overboard with his actions previously. However, what was done. He couldn't turn back time. He gritted his teeth and led a party of his men out to search for fir wood as well. After 4 hours, it was still Manager Chin who found some supplies of fir wood first and sent it back to the He estate. He had already gone out to buy wood a few times, so he had some connections. In just a short moment, the object that Chu Lian had entrusted to the old carpenter to bought was completed. Chu Lian ordered her people to move the object to one of the more deserted courtyards. She then ordered them to harness horses to the object and test how the object moved over an area that was covered in knee-deep snow. When she saw that there were only 2 shallow tracks on the snow where the horses had apsed, Chu Lian then passed orders to Manager Chin to have heavy items put on top of the object for another test. The result? The horses were actually able to maintain a normal speed, even while pulling a load of goods. Manager Chin couldn't help but cry out in surprise, "Third young madam, it was a success." Chu Lian heaved a sigh of relief and let out a refreshed smile. With this, they wouldn't have to worry about the problem of transporting goods through heavy snow. Winching and Wanlan had similar expressions of joy. Wanlan asked excitedly, "Third young madam, what is this thing called?" Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes were curved into crescents as she spoke in a tender and soft tone. "A snowboat." "A snowboat? A boat that can travel over snow?" Manager Chin's eyes lit up and he praised her. What a fitting name. The old carpenter and his helpers were already smiling from ear to ear as they watched from the side. Chu Lian came closer to examine the snowboat. Actually, it was a sleigh that was commonly used during winter in the northeast of China back in the modern world. It could also be called a sled, but there were some differences between sleds and sleighs. There were many different types of sleighs, but the one she had drawn out was most suited for transporting goods. It was slightly larger than most sleighs and should be able to withstand the same load that normal carriages could. They could even create a small warm pin on top of the sleigh by putting up a tent of animal skins and leaving small windows at the side for ventilation. With braziers within for warmth, they would be able to travel long distances without getting frozen. TL note, Chu Lian made up her own name for the sleigh. She actually literally named it Landboat, but Snowboat seems to fit better here. I live on an island in eternal summer, so I don't really know much about snow in winter. I had to do more research into the different types of snow transport, and I learned all sorts of things today. XD. So from my research, sleighs are bigger and are usually drawn by horses, reindeer, or machines now. Sleds are smaller and usually meant for faster transport and are usually pulled by dogs, especially in those dog sled races. They can also be used by themselves to slide down snowy hills, which looks tremendously fun. 3 horse-drawn sleigh for goods, Chu Lian's snowboat, dog sled. Chapter 363, Snowboat 2. This story is completely free to read on Volare Novels. Please support my translations on the original source. With a wave of Chu Lian's hand, Manager Chin ordered their men to move the sleigh back to the courtyard. On their way back, the joy on everyone's faces shone through undisguised. Manager Chin was smart enough to realize how important the sleigh was. He moved into a room close to the sleigh's storehouse and even ordered some guards to keep a close watch on the carpenter and his family. Winching and Wanlan helped Chu Lian back to her room. Wanlan's face was flushed red from the icy winds outside, but her joyful mood wasn't affected. "Third young madam, Are we going to send the snowboat to the border camp now? Chu Lian shook her head. It's too late now. Night is about to fall, and it's still snowing outside. It's not safe to travel at this time. Furthermore, I still have a few more designs to draw. While Wanlan was a little disappointed with her answer, she didn't question further. Just as Chu Lian had settled down at her desk and flipped over a fresh sheet of paper, preparing to draw out the design for the warm pin, Liu came in with quick strides to report something. Chu Lian turned to her with a strange look and charcoal pencil in hand. What's wrong? Liu frowned, but replied honestly. Honored lady, Leader Mo is outside the courtyard. He and his subordinates are carrying a large piece of fir wood, and they're requesting entrance. Chu Lian stayed silent for a moment. Mo Chengue was seriously out to make her mad today. Wanlan huffed. So it's only now that he realizes our third young madam wasn't doing all that for nothing? Why didn't he mind his own business earlier? If not for him, we might have been able to send the snowboat to the camp today. Our third young madam's snowboat is already completed, so we don't even need that fir wood of his. What's he doing here now? Chu Lian waved her hand, indicating for Liu to send them away. Liu pressed her lips together and decided to report everything she had heard. Third young madam, this subordinate knows that Leader Mo and his men have committed wrongs. However, this subordinate heard from the old soldiers that Leader Mo traded all of his winter clothing and cloaks in order to buy that one piece of fir wood. Right now, he's just wearing his inner clothing as he stands outside the courtyard. Although he's an old soldier, he'll likely fall sick from the cold outside sooner or later. Chu Lian's brows finally drew together into a frown. Liu wasn't trying to speak for Mo Chengue at all. She was simply worried that He Changdi would blame Chu Lian if anything really happened to Mo Chengue due to exposure to the cold. Chu Lian could sense Liu's good intentions. Tell him to put the fir wood down and return to his courtyard with his men. Chu Lian paused before turning to Wanlan. Go over personally and give them something to eat. After hearing her orders, Liu was clearly relieved. She quickly went off to carry out the task she had been given. Once Liu had left the room, Wanlan mumbled in complaint. Third young madam, are you really going to have this servant send them something to eat even after what he did? Chu Lian looked up and shot her a look. It's just some porridge and buns. When did you become so stingy, you little rascal? Furthermore, those are just some simple items. If we're able to bribe Leader Mo with those, won't it save us more time and energy? She wouldn't even have to speak then. Upon hearing Chu Lian's words, Wanlan gaped. Fine, she was worrying for nothing then. Their third young madam probably already had some plan in mind. She should be lighting a candle and praying for that Leader Mo instead. As expected, once Wanlan sent over a pot of porridge and a box of buns over to Leader Mo's courtyard, that stubborn old soldier really ended up getting bought over by the food. The man who had refused to eat anything from Chu Lian's courtyard was now the most fervent fan of her food. He even snatched more than half of the buns in the box just for himself and refused to let anyone have them. All of the old soldiers were now ashamed to be part of Mo Chengue's party. However, the scar-faced Leader Mo was so thick-skinned that his eyes didn't even twitch when faced with his old comrades' mocking remarks. Early in the morning, Great General Qian gathered his most trusted subordinates in the commander's tent. Once everyone left the commander's tent, most of their faces looked about the same as He Sanlang's usual icy expression. Xiao Hongyu patted He Changdi's shoulder with a bitter smile. I'm not used to there being so many brother He's in the camp so suddenly. When Zhang Mai saw that he still had the mood to joke around, he glared fiercely at the brat. Xiao Hongyu pouted with a wronged expression. Even the officers had been forced to eat bean paste these few days. Couldn't he just crack a joke to lift the mood a little? He Sanlang stood on the observation tower in camp and looked towards the horizon. Urgency was like a raging beast in his heart. Why hadn't they come yet? Chapter 364. Immediate Needs. 1. Of course, he wasn't waiting for Chu Lian. Although the Chu Lian of his lifetime seemed to be a whole other person from the previous one, He Sanlang's feelings for her were growing the more he interacted with her. However, He Changdi had never thought that Chu Lian might have a solution for the border troop situation. In his eyes, as clever and cunning as Chu Lian was, she wasn't so capable as to share in the burden of helping the border troops. Although he only had a rough understanding of what had happened in this war from his previous life, since had already managed to cheat death once, he wouldn't be so silly as to sit and wait for his second death. Once he saw the border troops' situation for himself, he had still sighed in worry. He understood that his preparations were far from enough. It might still be able to help the border troops out of trouble momentarily, but it wouldn't be able to treat the root of their problems. It hadn't been that long since Changdi had come to the border, so it was already pretty impressive that he had been able to take some preemptive measures. Captain, it looks like there's someone over there. Changdi's thoughts were pulled back into reality by the guards on duty. His gaze lifted and focused on the swirling snow in the distance. The wind-propelled snow blocked most of his vision, but he could still make out the vague outline of a party of men and horses. Changdi's eyes shone with life, and the eternal ice that covered his face seemed to have melted a little. He signaled the soldiers up on the watchtower and strode towards the tower himself. When he reached the foot of the tower, he shouted for his personal guards and mounted his horse. In a short moment, he was already leading his soldiers out of the main camp and sprinting towards the barely visible group of people in front. The guards on the watchtower waved a small red flag and made a few signals towards the camp. The soldiers on patrol immediately informed their leaders, rousing the camp. Barely a few moments later, a few hundred people had charged out of the camp, hot on the heels of Sanlang. Before he had even reached the group of men and horses in the snow, Changdi leaped from his horse, making a somersault before landing soundly right in front of the leader of the party. It was only after they had drawn close that Changdi's guards finally saw that it was a merchant caravan they were facing. They formed a long line of men with 20 or more carriages following behind. The carriages were clearly used for transport and loaded down with goods. The guards' eyes lit up the moment they realized what the caravan was transporting. They couldn't resist gulping down some drool. This carriage couldn't possibly be transporting food. They hadn't been to eat their fill for many days by now. The leader of the caravan was seated at the front of the first carriage. He was completely wrapped up in a fur cloak, topped off with a fur hat, such that only his eyes could be seen. By this time, his gaze had also landed on Sanlang. He stumbled off the carriage and almost fell into the slough. With staggering steps, he ran towards Changdi and made it in front of him in just 2 strides. He immediately kneeled down without caring for the calf-deep snow and broke out into loud wails. "Third young master, this servant has finally returned. This servant hasn't failed you." Liue's voice was all hoarse, and even the skin on his face had cracked up from the harsh winds. He completely disregarded his image and sobbed his heart out with his snot and tears flowing out freely, making an absolutely pitiful picture. Changdi felt that his manservant was being ridiculous, but his heart was filled with warmth. He hadn't trusted the wrong person in this lifetime. All right, get up. Don't tell me you're planning to sleep overnight on the snow here." While Sanlang spoke in his usual cold one, everyone could sense the caring in his words. Liue immediately scrambled up from the ground. He roughly brushed away the tears left on his face before pulling down the fur hood wrapped around his neck. It was only then that Sanlang could finally see his manservant's face. After so many months apart, Liue's originally chubby face had slimmed down entirely. Right now, there were traces of maturity showing on his face. However, with his disheveled stubble, dry and cracked lips, as well as frost-reddened skin, he didn't make for a pretty picture. His heart had been in his throat for the whole journey here to the north with the supply caravan. Now that he had finally accomplished this mission, it was as if a burden had lifted from his heart. He smiled like a silly fool at Changdi. As for Changdi's guards, when they heard what their captain and the wretched-looking man before them had said, their jaws dropped in shock. Despite his appearance, the leader of the caravan was one of their captain's subordinates? Didn't that mean that all of the supplies in this caravan were meant for the border camp? The guards couldn't hide their joy at all. The winds were harsh and snow was beating on their faces. It was cold and painful, but the hearts of the soldiers were brimming with warmth. Changdi gave out straightforward orders and had his personal guards take over the supply caravan that Liue had brought. He told Liue to get on a horse and follow him back to the main camp to report the good news first. Liue knew that time was of the essence, so he gathered up the last of his strength. On the way back to the camp, he explained everything he had done to Changdi. Third young master, this servant followed your orders and bought supplies near the Yueqin Mountains. Even after 2 months, this servant was only able to gather up 200,000 kilograms of food. When we were crossing the border into Liangzhou, we were attacked by barbarians and we lost around 20,000 kilograms of our supplies. Taking away the supplies we used on the journey here, we only had 150,000 kilograms worth left by the time we came to the heart of Liangzhou. 150,000 kilograms of food. If they went by the normal amount of army rations, it would only be enough to feed 50,000 troops for 6 to 7 days. Even in these extreme circumstances, it wouldn't last more than 10 days. The border troops were already running out of supplies. This 150,000 kilograms of food could only buy them a few more days. They were still treading very close to danger. He had to find another way. Changdi's hands curled up into fists so tight that he almost snapped his reins. He gazed at the camp in the distance with unreadable eyes and a resolute expression, cheering himself on in his heart. He was no longer the Changdi of the past. He was going to find a way to get the border troops out of this crisis. The current snowstorm was likely to last for another month. They had to survive this month somehow and mount a counterattack to take down the two Huns once and for all. Chapter 365. Immediate Needs 2. When Changdi brought Liyue back to camp and dismounted from his horse at the entrance, he realized that Great General Qian was already waiting at the entrance with the other officers in tow. Great General Qian was smiling from ear to ear and eyeing Changdi as if he was carrying a whole store of grain. Some of the soldiers had likely run ahead of him and reported the good news to Great General Qian first. Sanlang kept his face cool and calm as usual, but General Qian didn't show any hint of dislike this time. He came forward and slapped Changdi's shoulder forcefully and stopped Changdi before he could make a salute. "You brat. So you were still keeping this ace up your sleeve. Come, let's go to my tent and have a talk." Changdi shot a look at Liyue to indicate that he should follow. It was only after 2 whole hours that General Qian finally let Sanlang and Liyue go. Liyue's face was full of happiness. He followed behind his young master like an annoying duckling. "Third young master, did you hear that? The general said that you've made a huge contribution this time, so you'll be able to return to the capital once the war is over. Too bad the roads are all blocked by this snowstorm now. Otherwise this servant would definitely write back to the estate with this piece of good news. If third young madam were to find out, wouldn't she be over the moon?" Changdi had calmed down by now. He didn't share Liyue's joy, as the biggest cause of the problem hadn't been solved yet. The food that Liyue had sent over was only enough to solve their immediate needs, and they were merely delaying the ticking time bomb about to explode in their faces. He just couldn't cheer up at all. While his worries still dominated his heart, it was easy for his mood to shift. However, Liyue still had to mention Chu Lian. Changdi's eyes narrowed into slits. That wicked woman Chu Lian. If not for her, he wouldn't have met such a terrible fate. He wouldn't have reincarnated and come running out to this drat border to fight for a slim chance of survival. Changdi snorted. "So you were bought over by just a single bowl of third young madam's braised pork? How cheap." Liyue shrunk back. He had instantly realized that his master was angry from that mocking tone of his. However, hadn't he been perfectly fine moments ago? Why was he so unhappy now? Liyue scratched his head in confusion. He just couldn't understand the complicated nuances of his young master's moods. Then this servant won't write any letters to third young madam. This servant will only write to the matriarch and madam. They'll be extremely delighted for sure. Changdi sneered. Could his manservant get any more stupid? If he wrote back to the estate, wouldn't his doting grandmother tell that wicked woman everything anyway? When Sanlang abruptly realized that his mind was drifting to meaningless possibilities, he blanked out for a moment before pressing his lips together. He said, "You don't have to think about writing back. Your third young madam is right here in Liangzhou City." Changdi's tone was emotionless, but Liyue jumped in surprise after hearing his words. His eyes opened wide as he asked in disbelief, "Third young master, what did you say? Third young madam is here in Liangzhou?" The only reply that Liyue got from He Sanlang was a cold sneer frosty enough to freeze his nose off. This time, Liyue finally believed that third young madam had really come to Liangzhou. He quickly spoke up, "Then this servant will rest for 2 days and go to visit third young madam after this servant's body has warmed up. It's not easy for third young madam to come all the way to Liangzhou as a young lady." As Liyue mumbled by his ear about how it wasn't easy for a woman to travel this far out, the ice block that was He Changdi's face slowly started to melt. His imagination brought forth an image to his mind. He thought of how Chu Lian must have trudged through the snow while holding up her thin skirt, showing how her pretty embroidered shoes had been soaked through. Her cheeks had most likely been flushed red from the cold winds, while her wide eyes had been filled with unshed tears as she soldiered on. A strong breeze almost pushed the Chu Lian of his imagination into the snow. That wicked woman abruptly looked up towards him with 2 watery and aggrieved eyes. He Changdi's body froze, and he was filled with the urge to reach out to pull her into his arms and wrap her entire person with his warm cloak and embrace. However, the reality was vastly different from He Sanlang's imagination. On her way here, Chu Lian had simply sat in a brazier-warmed carriage with hand warmers. She had been wrapped in a fur coat coupled with fur-lined boots. She hadn't even gotten a single chilblain from the cold. How could she possibly have come to the north by walking through the snow? If the overly imaginative He Sanlang were to find out the truth, who knows if he would be angry with himself or the wicked woman Chu Lian. This time, He Changdi kept his calm and didn't speak a word of agreement or disapproval. However, Liyue had been serving his master for a long time, so of course he understood his master's thoughts. Actually, their third young master was a really kind person. He was just held back by his pride sometimes. Liyue chuckled and took He Sanlang's silence as approval. After he finished chatting about happier matters, the smile on Liyue's face slowly vanished. He spoke in a grave tone, "Third young master, while this servant was in the Yueqin Mountains, this servant wanted to buy more food, but this servant didn't have enough silver on hand. This servant used up all the silver and traded away the jade amulets and accessories you gave, but this servant was only able to bring back this much." Chapter 366. Where is she now? 1. Even before Liyue had explained his actions, He Changdi had already guessed at the situation. "No matter. This isn't your fault. You've done well this time. Let's head back and have a meal and some rest." Liyue made a sound of agreement before following one of He Changdi's guards to a tent where he could rest. As Liyue watched his young master turn back into his tent with his brows tightly knitted together, he lamented in his heart. Third young master had really put his all into this gamble. When Liyue remembered how his master had been just like any other noble young man in the capital before, and compared it to his current penniless person, he felt extremely sad. He didn't understand why his young master had been so resolute in his decision to come to the northern border. His initial dissatisfaction towards third young madam definitely wasn't one of the reasons. They had used up all of the money they had brought from the capital, along with all the properties in third young master's name. They didn't have a single piece of value left. Right now, other than his rank as Captain He, third young master had nothing else to his name. He was probably even more poor than those concubine-born sons in third-rate noble houses. Through letters from home, Liyue had also heard of the things that Chu Lian had done in the capital. Third young madam was a really capable person. Who could have thought that a noble young lady would be so good at earning money? Just going by Gillen Restaurant alone, third young madam's pockets were likely filled to bursting. In the entire house Jing'an, it was probably third young madam who had the most money now. Now that third young madam had also come to Liangzhou, did that mean his wise and mighty young master would have to rely on his wife to keep himself fed now? As Liyue's mind continued wandering through these thoughts, he felt that his foresight was excellent. He had to quickly recover from his fatigue and toss his lot in with the wealthy third young madam. If He Sanlang were to find out that his manservant was thinking of switching sides, he would probably break all of the little bastard's legs. The lights in He Changdi's tent remained on until late in the night. He rubbed his temples tiredly as he fell into bed. His eyes stared straight up at the dark canopy of the tent as the wind howled from outside. As tired as he was, His tightly wound nerves meant that he didn't feel the slightest hint of sleepiness. He went through solutions in his mind for the whole night, but none of them were actually useful. With Xiao Hongyu's rhythmic snores as accompaniment, He Changdi subconsciously smoothed his elegant hands over the fluffy and warm fleece blanket covering him. The memory of the day Chu Lian had come to visit the camp floated into his mind. He turned on his side and took in a deep breath, wanting to get rid of the images in his head. However, there was a faint fragrance on the blanket covering him that made his memory even clearer. His brows drew together in frustration, and he almost made to throw the blanket onto the ground. Although that urge lingered in his mind, the hand he had placed on the blanket refused to move. It wasn't until the faint light of day had broken over the horizon that Sanlang was finally able to slip into slumber. Time passed quickly. The two Huns had practically stopped all attacks on the front line. They would only send small parties to launch sneak attacks from time to time, clearly trying to play the waiting game with the border troops. The two Huns' living conditions had been poor from the start. This wasn't the first time they had started eyeing the Great Wu dynasty's rich and fertile fields. They had been living on the grasslands and icy mountains for generation after generation. They weren't like the people of the Great Wu. The two Huns were already used to the harsh and bitter conditions of the north and the snowstorms and icy winds of the winter. Furthermore, the two Huns had been plotting an invasion for years. They had their ways to pass this harsh winter. As the snow fell even harder and the days grew even colder, the conditions were turning more and more to their favor. It was entirely different on the side of the Liangzhou border troops. The government had been spending huge sums to maintain the army at the border. There were quotas set on the military supplies sent every season. As the dynasty had settled into peace, the military officials started losing their influence and the respect of the court. The literary officials spread the ideals of leading the nation with virtues. In the previous year, the cabinet had argued for months over the sums needed for military expenditure. When it came to this year, military spending had been cut down even further rather than increased. Thus, the border troops were in imminent danger. Due to the early snows in Liangzhou this year, the army's winter supplies hadn't been able to make it here in time. It was as if their lifeline had been cut. The two Huns had spent a decade sharpening their blades, waiting for this chance. Although their weapons couldn't be compared to the Great Wu's, they had the advantage in having prepared enough food to last the whole of winter. It was the Liangzhou border troops who couldn't afford to wait. One of the officers had bristled with anger at the two Huns' tactics. He suggested gathering all 50,000 soldiers and feeding them a good meal before sending them out to trample the two Hun army without leaving a trace. The Liangzhou army was under the command of Duke Liu, so they weren't a bunch of cowardly soldiers. They had the courage to die on the battlefields to protect their country. The soldiers were good soldiers, and the leaders were good leaders. However, the two Hun army wasn't stupid. They weren't going to stand out and let the border troops attack them without fighting back. Nor did they leave their supplies out for just anyone to discover. The northern border was a huge land with a sparse population. Sometimes they wouldn't even see a single soul out there on the grass plains. The two Huns were used to living in these conditions and scrabbling for survival. Guerrilla warfare and hiding were what they were good at. The northern border was such a big space too. The most likely result from the angry officer's suggestion would be their 50,000 soldiers dying of hunger or exposure after crossing the river, even before finding any hint of the two Huns. Thus, all they could do was wait as their supplies dwindled down. If they wanted to bring supplies in, they would have to think of a way to get to the heartlands of the Great Wu. Chapter 367. Where is she now? 2. Another officer brought up a suggestion. How about raiding the barbarians? Heh. The barbarians were even poorer than the two Huns. They only knew how to graze their livestock, and they didn't even know if they would be able to survive the winter themselves. There was nothing for them to raid there. The barbarians were much fewer in number than the two Huns anyway. Most of them were scattered all throughout the plains. They also suffered from regular raids by the two Huns, so they were likely all hiding under a pile of snow somewhere. The troops couldn't depend on finding 10,000 nomadic barbarians to feed their 50,000 soldiers. Even the suggestion of having one last meal and fighting it out with the two Huns was better. In the end, no one had a solution that was sound enough. Most of the leaders in the army were old generals who had experienced many battles. Despite their many successes and ideas in the past, when it came to the current situation, all of them could only scratch their heads in futile search of a good solution. It wasn't as if General Qian hadn't tried sending men to Sioux City to bring back their supplies. However, half of the party had already suffered frostbite even before making it out of Liangzhou. Their carriages hadn't been able to move in the knee-deep snow. If they did miraculously make it to Sioux City, then how were they supposed to get the supplies back? They couldn't possibly rely on just men and pack horses. Transporting supplies for 50,000 soldiers on just the backs of men and horses? That was impossible. In the blink of an eye, 2 days had already passed. Right now, each passing day meant that their food supplies were shortened by a day. The secretary of the army was so worried about the food left in their stores. His originally white hair had grown even whiter. No matter how much they tried to scrimp and save, the food wasn't enough to last a single month. Early in the morning, Laiwe packed up a small bag. A red object shaped like a rod was sticking out of his bag. Right before he left, Laiwe came to He Changdi's tent to report. Xiao Hongyu was away leading his subordinates on a morning training exercise, so only He Sanlang was left in the tent. Laiwe set down the bag he was carrying on his back and stared at the objects in the bag while trying to hold back his drool. Third young master, are you really not going to eat some of this? This servant can keep some of this aside for you. All you've been eating in the army is being gruel for so many days. Wouldn't it be nice to have some of this to chew on for a change of taste occasionally? He Sanlang was holding a military tactic book in hand as he cast a cool glance at Laiwe. No need. These are all women's snacks. Why leave them for me? Give them all to your third young madam. Laiwe could only take up the bag once again. Third young master, is there any message you would like this servant to pass on to third young madam? He Changdi thought for a moment before walking over to his bedside and taking out a letter from under his pillow. He passed it over to Laiwe casually. Laiwe received the letter with both hands and smiled eagerly. It seemed like his master was warming up to his mistress. When He Sanlang caught sight of Laiwe's silly and joyful smile, his expression stiffened up a little and he aimed a kick at Laiwe's behind. Why haven't you gone yet? Are you waiting for me to escort you out? Laiwe dodged his young master's kick skillfully before chuckling. Third young master, please calm down. This servant will leave right now. This servant is good at writing, so third young madam will definitely get your letter as soon as possible. After saying so, Laiwe carefully placed He Changdi's letter in the bag containing stalks of sugarcane. When he left He Sanlang's tent, Laiwe was still carrying a smile on his face. Even though third young master had claimed not to like third young madam, just look at what he was doing now. He had spent so much effort to bring back this sugarcane, but third young master wasn't keeping a single piece. Instead, he was sending them all to third young madam. After an hour had passed, a familiar voice called out to He Changdi from outside the tent. He Changdi looked up from his tactic books with a frown. What was wrong with Laiwe? Hadn't he left just a while ago? Why was he back so soon? In the next second, He Changdi's cold and handsome face was contorted into an ugly expression. Had something happened to that wicked woman Chu Lian? When he thought of the possibility, He Sanlang couldn't hold still any longer. He stood up abruptly in panic, almost toppling his chair over. Just as he was about to grab his cloak and sword and rush out of his tent, the tent flap lifted and Laiwe entered from outside. His face was filled with joy, and he immediately started shouting even before he had completely entered the tent. Third young master, good news. He Changdi could sense Laiwe's excitement and uncontainable joy from his voice alone, so the tension and fright drained away from his heart. His grip on his scabbard loosened, although there was still some frost in his tone when he spoke. What happened? If you don't give me a good reason for all this, I'll sentence you to a suitable military punishment. The news was just too uplifting. Laiwe completely disregarded his master's threat and finished stepping into the tent. When he saw what He Changdi was holding in hand, he spoke up curiously. Third young master, are you on the way out? He Sanlang harumphed and set his cloak and sword back to their original places. Laiwe felt shivers go down his spine from the cold aura that his master was emanating, so he quickly reported everything he had just heard. This servant was on the way to Liangzhou's He estate this morning, but while on the way there, this servant met Sir Tang and Uncle Amo with a party of men and horses. On such a cold day and so much snow on the ground, they actually brought out a large carriage. This servant was stunned speechless, so this servant was about to go up and ask about what was going on when third young madam spoke from the carriage. After He Sanlang finished listening to Liu's explanation, the depths of his eyes grew darker. What did you say? The carriage that Chu Lian was sitting in didn't have any wheels? Liu nodded furiously, disbelief still clear on his face. This servant doesn't know how third young madam's carriage was built. It's strange enough that it doesn't have any wheels, but it can move really fast over snow, as if it's flying. It won't sink into the snow either. Thoughts flew through He Changdi's mind at lightning-fast speeds. Almost in the same instant, he thought of how this wheel-less carriage could be used. His eyes lit up like stars in the night sky. Even the cool and reserved He Sanlang had moments of excitement like this. Where is she now? Tell me, where is she? Chapter 368. Because I'm lazy. 1. Liu suffered a fright from seeing his master's sudden agitated state. He froze for a moment before quickly replying, Third young madam is still on the way here. This servant came back earlier to report the news first. Judging by the time, third young madam must have reached by now. Third young madam. Before Liu could finish speaking, He Sanlang rushed out of the tent like a whirlwind. Chu Lian wasn't going to report to Great General Qian about the slay herself. Firstly, it wasn't appropriate for her to do so as a woman according to the customs of this dynasty. Secondly, it was because she had a personal wish she wanted to fulfill. Although her lunatic husband was rather abnormal compared to most people, in the days after coming to the northern border and interacting with He Sanlang, her impression of him was much better than the day they had first met. Many times, it was just He Changdi's pride getting in the way of him speaking up. She was a generous person, so she decided not to be as narrow-minded as he was. Furthermore, even though she had been given the title of Honored Lady Jinni by the Emperor and was considered part of the imperial family, when others mentioned 6th Miss Chu, the first thing that would come to their minds would be her position as House Jing'an's third young madam, He Sanlang's wife. Married daughters were cut off from their family trees. Her honor or disgrace would reflect on the He family. Since she had a good idea and since she wasn't a harebrained person, the first person she had thought of was He Sanlang. Thus, before He Sanlang could ride out to find her, Chu Lian had already sent Imo Chungue out to find He Sanlang. Imo Chungue was able to find He Changdi mounted up on his horse right before he left the camp, but before Imo Chungue could speak up, He Changdi had already fired a question at him. Where's third young madam? Undisguised joy was showing on Imo Chungue's old face. Replying to third young master, third young madam is right behind and will reach the main camp in 15 minutes. Third young madam requests that you wait for her outside the camp. She has something she wants to say to you. With a wave of his whip, He Sanlang blazed off, leaving only the words, I'm going to look for her. Chu Lian was personally escorted to He Changdi's tent by the man himself. Chu Lian stared at the clearly anxious He Changdi with wide eyes and guessed that he had most likely thought of why she was here. She didn't beat around the bush and spoke to him straight. He Changdi, you saw the carriage I came here in. Here, these are the blueprints. I've also brought over the carpenter. Take a look and see if these will be useful. He Changdi reached out with his long fingers to take the blueprints from Chu Lian's slender hands. When his warm fingertips touched her chilled skin, despite the difference in temperature, a fuzzy feeling came to life in both their hearts. Chu Lian hurriedly retracted her fingers and coughed. For some reason, she felt that their interaction was somewhat awkward today. He Sanlang's attitude was very different from the norm. She had been calm at first, but now she was starting to feel a little fidgety. He Changdi was quick-witted. The snowboat that Chu Lian had brought to him set the ball rolling in his mind, instantly sparking plenty of ideas. He Sanlang's unfathomable gaze fell upon the frail young lady before him, who seemed like a little bunny who needed his protection. In that single instant, all sorts of emotions flashed through his pupils. When they settled down, only joy and warmth remained in the depths of his eyes. When He Changdi finally spoke, his tone was a little hoarse, but strangely sexy. Although it was just 2 short words, thank you, Chu Lian could feel the sincerity behind them. She looked at the urgency in He Changdi's expression. Without waiting for Changdi to prompt her, Chu Lian started explaining how the snowboats could be used. Following that, Chu Lian took Sanling over to the snowboat she had brought over, complete with an added heated pin. After 15 minutes, Sanling took the blueprints and headed to the commander's tent. A short while later, Great General Qian's trusted officers were all summoned to the commander's tent. Chu Lian stayed in Changdi's tent. Lai Yue kept watch on the goings-on outside. When Lai Yue entered the tent to report that Great General Qian had summoned all of his officers, it was only then that Chu Lian finally felt relief. It looked like General Qian was taking the snowboats seriously. Chu Lian heaved a long sigh of relief. Now that she had finally set down her burden, her body felt light and loose. She even had the mood to direct Wenqing and Wanlan in an effort to pack up the tent for Changdi. Only Chu Lian and her maidservants were left in the tent. As slow as they were, Wenqing and Wanlan had already understood the true reason why Chu Lian had ordered the snowboat to be built when Third Young Madam handed over the blueprints to Third Young Master. The respect that the two rascals had for their Third Young Madam only increased. They turned to Chu Lian with sparkling eyes like miniature suns. Chu Lian could feel the hairs on her arms standing up from their combined stares, even though she was seated by the warm brazier at the foot of the bed. She glared at Wenqing and Wanlan. "What are you looking at me like that for? I'm getting goosebumps." Wanlan had been serving Chu Lian for long enough that she was starting to come out of her introverted shell. She exclaimed, "Third Young Madam, you're so smart. How did you come up with the idea of a snowboat?" Chu Lian was speechless. She couldn't just say that she had gotten the idea from the sleighs of the modern world, after all. Thus, she could only do her best to come up with an explanation. "Think about it. We can travel over water using boats. This snowboat is exactly the same as a boat on water. However, a boat can only travel over water while a snowboat travels over snow. Although they're used in different locations, the principle behind them is the same." Wanlan nodded seriously. She didn't forget to add in some praise while she was at it. "Although the idea is simple, we servants weren't able to think of it at all. It's still Third Young Madam who's the smartest of us all." Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Chapter 369. Because I'm Lazy, 2. Wenqing noticed that Chu Lian was rubbing her hands together and huffing out her breath to warm them, so she quickly stuffed a new hand warmer into her hands. She hesitated before asking, "Third Young Madam, since you were the one who came up with the idea, why didn't you give the blueprints directly to General Qian?" After Wenqing blurted out the question, she immediately realized that it wasn't appropriate. She hurriedly tried to make up for it. "Third Young Madam, please don't blame this servant." This servant went over the line. This servant shouldn't have cast doubt on Third Young Madam's decision. Chu Lian looked up just in time to catch the fear that flashed across Wenqing's face. She reacted with a bright, yet cunning smile. Her beautiful almond-shaped eyes curved into upturned crescent moons. "I have nothing to hide from the two of you. If you want to know, I'll just tell you. Of course it's because I'm lazy. There is a saying called, self-preservation is the first law of nature. Everyone has moments when they're selfish, when their beloved partners are no longer more important than their own selves. Isn't it more silly not to put your own survival first? If you don't even treat yourself well, how can you expect others to treat you well?" There was nothing wrong about Wenqing's question. If Chu Lian had presented the snowboat to Great General Qian today, then she would definitely have gotten credited for the major contribution. From their understanding of General Qian's personality, if the northern border troops managed to overcome this trial, he would likely push for a promotion for Chu Lian. Even if she didn't mention anything to him, she would most likely rise up another rank or even become a royal princess. However, Chu Lian had gone straight to Third Young Master the moment she had arrived in the camp. She had even ordered the men in her party not to reveal that she had been the one to design the snowboat. Wenqing and Wanlan had been waiting with bated breath to hear what kind of righteous reason Chu Lian had for doing so. Could it be that Third Young Madam's heart was filled with Third Young Master, and that her goal was to become her husband's silent support? Or perhaps she wanted to become a hidden hero? Although there were plenty of hot-blooded reasons, those were completely unrelated to Chu Lian. She had actually revealed without any shame at all that she had just been too lazy. The flames burning in Winching and Wanlan's eyes were instantly extinguished by a basin of ice-cold water and disappeared without even the slightest trace of smoke. Winching and Wanlan's faces were now stiff. The corners of their lips twitched as they tried to think of a reply for their mistress. Third young madam kept mumbling about third young master being a lunatic, but from their point of view, third young madam wasn't any better. Just take a look at the other noble madams. They fought for their husband's favor all the time. When their third young master wasn't around in the estate, their third young madam lived even more happily than when he was around. Other noble madams cared about their reputation. Their third young madam treated her honored lady title as if it was just for show. Other noble madams loved to dress up. Their third young madam was only occupied with eating. Winching and Wanlan ranted crazily in their hearts. Chu Lian glanced at her abnormally silent maidservants and noticed that their expressions were quite blank, so she kindly explained further. Think about it. If I were to give the snowboat blueprints directly to General Qian, he would definitely keep me in his tent for questioning. Later on, the rest of the officers would also have to ask me tons of questions. Following that, it would be having to coordinate the mass production of the snowboats, setting the principles and discussing the usage of the snowboats. The moment she thought of all that had to be done, Chu Lian felt dizzy. Rather than working herself to the bone, why not hand over the tiring stuff to Yi Sanling? He would definitely be willing to do it. Winching and Wanlan. The two of them were a little exasperated by third young madam's reasoning. Don't you want everyone to see you in a new light, third young madam? If the emperor ever found out about this, he might even praise their third young madam in front of the whole court. That was an honor that most people couldn't even dream about. With that, every time anyone in the capital mentioned Chu Lian, the first thing they would think about wouldn't be how her fertility had caught House Jing and Sai. Everyone would have to be respectful towards their third young madam, so as not to offend the emperor then. That lady from House Ding Yuan, Zhou Yuan Qin, wouldn't have the guts to frame third young madam any longer. Chu Lian stared curiously at Winching and Wanlan. She hadn't expected her two maidservants to be so competitive. She found it funny and smiled as she said, "Why do I have to make others see me in a new light? I think that it's good enough for me to eat well and live well. Why do I need approval from others? It's not like I'm living for other people's attention. It's good enough if I'm happy. I like to be comfortable, and I don't like to worry about so many things. Let me tell you girls, if you worry too much, you'll age faster." Chu Lian reached out to poke Winching and Wanlan's foreheads, copying the mannerisms of an elder educating her juniors. Winching and Wanlan were shocked stiff by third young madam's strange worldview. Their jaws dropped in amazement. Chu Lian smiled. "Does this mean that you girls think General Sima is impressive?" Winching and Wanlan nodded furiously. Of course. General Sima was quite well known in the army despite her young age. Even they had heard of General Sima when they had been in the capital. Any woman who knew a bit of martial arts would admire General Sima. She was the modern Hua Mulan. Even the Empress Dowager, who usually remained a recluse in the palace and never talked about court matters, had personally praised Sima Hui at the national banquet and awarded her with a set of custom-made armor. Chapter 370, Teppanyaki 1. Chu Lian smiled in response without any intention of blaming Winching and Wanlan. Instead, she said, "Lady General Sima is already 20 this year, yet she has not wed. After her grandfather, old General Sima, passed on, she has never returned to her hometown in Shandong. Her female soldiers often receive harsh criticism from others, so other than those affiliated with old General Sima, Lady General Sima rarely has dealings with aristocratic families. General Sima seems to have spent the past 3 new years in camp." Despite Chu Lian's calm tone, Winching and Wanlan were already gaping with surprise. They had no idea that the almighty General Sima's life wasn't as good as they imagined it to be. Winching and Wanlan instantly felt that General Sima's tiresome life was nowhere as good as theirs. They had the pleasure of eating delicacies alongside third young madam while living idle lives. The two young ladies didn't realize that their worldview was gradually being thwarted by their mistress, a rare glint of wit shone in Chu Lian's eyes. Wasn't there a saying about how the nail that sticks out gets hammered down? She didn't want to draw unwanted attention. In any case, as he Changda's wife, she could use him as a shield for everything. It would be a waste if she didn't use the conveniently placed scapegoat. As for her, she just had to live happily as a lazy layabout. She wasn't the original Chulian, so she didn't have any thoughts of taking revenge. Go out and ask around the camp. What are they having for dinner now? Wenqing and Wanlan hadn't even recovered from the daze induced by Chu Lian's words. When they heard third young madam's question, the two of them channeled He Sanlang's spirit as their expressions turned dark. In the end, Wenqing sighed. Fine. Their third young madam was intent on laying low like an ostrich for the rest of her life. Since their mistress couldn't be bothered, why did they, as her servants, have to worry about? Wenqing accepted her fate and headed out to carry out her orders. A short while later, Wenqing returned and reported her findings to Chu Lian in detail. Chu Lian's mouth was agape, and her face was filled with shock. She gulped with some difficulty. Bean paste? She thought back to the last time she had eaten with He Sanlang when she had been served that weird-smelling bowl of disgusting black porridge and lost all appetite. Third young madam, should we eat with them? When in an army camp, most visitors simply shared what the soldiers had. With lingering fear, Chu Lian quickly shook her head. I think it's better if we prepare our own. They could start up their own stove and use their own ingredients instead of army supplies. Her status was also different from most people, so no one would dare to gossip about her actions. Since He Changdi hadn't returned, it wasn't appropriate for her to leave without saying her goodbyes either. As expected, Great General Qian's meeting with his officers took a long time. Although the sky had darkened and the snow had also lightened up, the officers of the right-wing army still hadn't returned. Chu Lian was already feeling hungry, so she chose not to wait for He Sanlang and ordered Wenqing and Wanlan to make preparations. Wenqing carefully held a round piece of metal while trembling. Third young madam, are you really going to use third young master's chest plate? Chu Lian nodded. She had searched all over the tent, and this chest plate was the closest to what she wanted. It was round and approximately the same size as a regular frying pan. She rapped on its metallic surface, confirming that this was indeed the most suitable item for teppanyaki. Chu Lian was satisfied with it. Why are you wasting time? Hurry up and place it on the brazier. Wanlan was close to tears. Third young madam, why don't you let this servant look for something else more suitable instead? It doesn't seem like a good idea to use third young master's chest plate. The third young master has to use this on the battlefield. Chu Lian turned to look at the armor displayed on the wooden frame and shook her head with a chuckle. Going to war in armor that looked like it weighed 100 kilograms? It was truly miraculous that He Changdi hadn't gotten injured on the battlefield thus far. Don't worry. If my husband comes looking for someone to blame, just say that you did it under my orders. Unable to change Chu Lian's mind, they could only submit to her orders. The chest plate even had a slight depression in its center, like it had been born to be a frying pan. Chu Lian had Wenqing wash the chest plate before she placed it over the brazier. After heating it up, she placed a piece of lard on top of it. There was no way around it. Vegetable oil hadn't been invented yet in the Great Wu dynasty, so she could only make do with lard. The snow-white piece of lard quickly dissolved on the chest plate, turning into a pool of aromatic oil. Next, Chu Lian took a plate of thin marinated beef slices from Wanlan and placed them one by one on the makeshift frying pan. When the thin slices of beef came into contact with the hot, greasy lard, it instantly gave off a sizzling sound. The originally flat slices of beef began to shrink. They turned from interspersed pale red and white to a nice and even brown. Its aroma was also released into the air, permeating throughout the whole tent. Chu Lian used a specially made spatula to slap the beef a few times before she took out a small white bottle and poured seasoning onto the meat. For some reason, the unknown seasoning in the bottle made the originally mouth-watering aroma several times better. Her fair and delicate hands handled the spatula nimbly, flipping the pieces of meat over with deft movements. She then poured out more seasoning and used a pair of chopsticks to place them on an empty plate. Chu Lian glanced at the two girls who were gulping down their saliva with all their might. With a smile, she asked, Wenqing, do you want to give it a taste? Wenqing's eyes lit up like fireworks. She quickly picked up a pair of chopsticks and stuffed a slice of beef into her mouth without any care for how hot it was. She sucked in air frantically due to the heat, but she couldn't bear to spit it out of her mouth. When she finally managed to swallow, her lips were all red. TL note: teppanyaki is a type of Japanese cuisine where they cook food on a heated iron surface, and that's exactly what Chulian is. Hilariously, doing XD, this is my guess for what Sanlang's armor should look like, going by the chest plate. Disclaimer: probably not historically accurate as I don't know enough about Chinese history. Ancient Chinese armor, and here we have the food porn, teppanyaki beef slices, teppanyaki beef steak. If you've never heard of teppanyaki before, here's a video of what it's like in Japan. And this is what it's like when it's done showman style. Chapter 371. Teppanyaki 2. Before Chu Lian could ask, Wanlan had already piped up impatiently. How is it, sis? Is it good? Is it tasty? Wenqing couldn't spare any thought to being reserved at this moment. She nodded enthusiastically with a hand over her mouth. Wanlan was dying of envy inside. She didn't know what third young madam used, but this aroma was just too overwhelming. She stared expectantly at Chu Lian and complained, "Third young madam, you're being biased." Chu Lian laughed. "Don't you like spicy food? I'll make a spicy one for you." Wenlin's eyes sparkled. So this could also be made spicy. Chu Lian followed the same steps as before, but added some chili powder while she was grilling the beef slices. As expected, Wanlan enjoyed it so much that she felt like swallowing her tongue along with the food. They had been serving Chu Lian for a while now. When Chu Lian cooked, she had never avoided her close aides. Wenqing and Wanlan were no longer the same girls who didn't even know how to make candied kumquats back when they had just entered Songtao court. While serving Chu Lian, they had eaten plenty of delicacies, but it was the first time that they had tasted such an amazing dish. Wenqing and Wenlin's eyes were alight with sparkles. Cooking teppanyaki was incredibly simple. As long as they prepared some good seasoning, it would be easy for a beginner to put out a decent tasting dish. They were in the thick of winter now, where water turned to ice. Winters in the northern border have always been colder than in the capital. There were also only grasslands to be found in this area, so there was very little vegetation available at this time. The main sources of food for the people in this area were beef and mutton. Grain crops, on the other hand, were pure extravagance. This could be seen from how the officers still had meat in their meals despite the lack of provisions. Back in Liangzhou City, she had ordered the He Estate's guards to slaughter several yaks and sheep. Half of the meat had been taken outside to be frozen and stored. At this point of time, the northern border was like a natural refrigerator. Meat could be kept even without curing. When it was time to eat, they just had to take out and prepare the frozen meat. The beef and mutton Chu Lian ate were all stored like this. At such low temperatures, the freshness of the meat wasn't really affected at all. Chu Lian demonstrated the process a few times in front of Wenqing and Wanlan before completely handing over the task to the two maidservants. She watched over the bowl of lamb organ soup boiling in another earthenware pot and stirred it with a wooden ladle from time to time. She tasted it and nodded. The fire was just right and it was almost done. Wanlan placed a plate of slightly spicy grilled beef slices on the small table in front of Chu Lian before serving her a bowl of warm and nourishing lamb organ soup. Chu Lian picked up her chopsticks and sniffed lightly. Ah, only this kind of aroma could be called dinner. As for that bean paste, she would leave it to the officers and soldiers of the camp to finish. While Chu Lian and her servants were happily cooking up delicacies in the tent, the soldiers guarding the tent outside were suffering. Although the tent entrance was covered with a thick felt curtain to block the wind and snow, it couldn't hold back the aroma of food at all. From a small gap in the tent entrance, an enticing aroma drifted out, testing the hungry guards' restraint and making their eyes turn red. That maidservant had only brought 2 pieces of frozen meat into the tent. They couldn't understand how she could produce such an alluring fragrance in such a short amount of time. Damn it! Today's guard shift was going to be torture. The 2 soldiers wanted to rush in and ask Honored Lady what she was doing. If only she might award them with a piece of whatever smelled so good. However, the memory of He Sanlang's usual cold expression kept them in bay. The 2 guards really didn't have the guts to disregard their orders, so they could only cry out in their hearts. Each of the officers leaving the commander's tent had the same expression, as if dark clouds had finally been chased away. Even the atmosphere in camp had suddenly warmed up. He Changdi was met with smiles and praise from everyone that he met. Gao Jiangwei stood at the entrance of the commander's tent. His jealous gaze was fixed on He Sanlang's ramrod straight back. He watched as Captain Gua and some other officers slung their arms around He Sanlang's shoulder and massaged his back a little. Even Sima Hui was standing not too far away, looking at He Changdi with a complex gaze. The veins on Gao Jiangwei's forehead popped out, and his hands curled into fists so tight that his bones ground against each other with a popping sound. Unfortunately, the slight noise was covered by the howling of wind, so no one heard it at all. When Sima Hui recalled the blueprint that He Changdi had spread out in front of Great General Qian, she followed behind the officers of the right-wing army in a daze, along with her female adjutant. As she watched how close Xiao Hongyu, Captain Gua, and Zhang Mai seemed to be to He Sanlang, envy rose from her heart. Sima Hu's bold eyebrows drew together with a trace of sadness as the worried Xiaoju watched her general's reaction from the side. Captain Gua and the others in front quickly reached He Changdi's tent. The moment they arrived, a faint and tantalizing aroma drifted over. Mixed in with the cold wind, the aroma became even more distinct. Xiao Hongyu's first reaction was to scold the culprit behind the aroma. Damn. Which bastard is eating secretly by himself? Why does it smell so good? He sniffed the air, posing just like a dog would, before his gaze landed on He Changdi's tent. Xiao Hongyu was stunned for a moment, but he quickly recovered and spoke excitedly with joy. Brother He, is sister-in-law here? By the time He Sanlang finally regained his senses, he realized that the wicked woman was cooking up something again. Sima Hui stared blankly upon hearing this from behind their party. He Sanlang's wife, honored Lady Genie? That delicious aroma piqued her curiosity. She suddenly wanted to meet honored Lady Genie. Chapter 372. Gathering for a Meal 1. Thus, Xiao Hongyu and his friends witnessed a very strange scene. The normally solitary and aloof General Sima suddenly started chasing after their group. Xiao Hongyu shot a sneaky and teasing look at He Changdi. He looked like he was preparing to settle down and watch a good show. When Zhang Mai spotted what their youngest member had done, he slapped the back of Xiao Hongyu's head. Captain Gua was the eldest of the group and the most mature one. He peeked at He Sanlang's cold expression and realized that he wasn't going to speak up. In the end, Captain Gua had to take up the role of speaking for the group and made a greeting bow towards Sima Hui. How may we assist you, General Sima? Although Sima Hui's features gave off a certain heroic spirit that most girls wouldn't have, she looked especially gentle when she smiled. Her actions were also upright and straightforward, so most of the officers in the army held a good impression of her. Since Sima Hui was trying to be friendly, they couldn't just reject her overtures. She was a woman too, so that meant that it would be an even greater faux pas if they didn't respond to her. This general heard that honored Lady Genie has come to the camp today. The last time honored lady came over with extra supplies, this general wasn't able to meet her, so this time, this general has to pay her a visit today at the very least. General Sima's reason made it hard for them to reject her. Since the general was here to visit Chulian, and they were both female, they couldn't really stop them as a bunch of guys. Furthermore, it was already pretty late now. Honored Lady Genie definitely wouldn't be able to return to Liangzhou City tonight. He Sanlang shared a tent with Xiao Hongyu, and it wasn't appropriate for them to let He Sanlang and his wife have the tent by themselves. They would have to request for assistance from General Sima in the end anyway. If they offended her at this point, it wouldn't be good for them. Captain Gua's thoughts ran quickly. He spoke with a polite tone. We're on our way to visit honored lady as well. Since General Sima has the same intention, why don't we go together? Xiao Hongyu saw that He Changdi's gaze hadn't even grazed Sima Hui's body for even a second, so he rubbed the back of his head. When there wasn't any exciting gossip or drama to look at, he felt a little bored. Zhang Mai and Xiao Hongyu had no objections to Sima Hui's addition to their party. Only He Changdi seemed to be emanating an icy aura to keep people thousands of miles away from his person, but his unspoken opinion was automatically disregarded. Sima Hui's gaze drifted casually over to He Changdi. When she realized that his eyes hadn't turned in her direction even once, a pang of pain rose in her heart before abruptly fading into nothing. She smiled mockingly at herself inwardly. It wouldn't have been possible between them anyway. It was better if she could let it go. After finally letting go of the twisted emotions in her heart, self-confidence returned to Sima Hui's expression, and she started exuding a charismatic and magnetic aura. Since that's so, let's go together. Today's teppanyaki had been rather good, especially when paired with that warming lamb organ soup. After she had gulped down the bowl of soup, it felt like her entire body had warmed up. Chu Lian had her plate in hand as she ate her late dinner. However, she was only able to eat a few bites of the delicious grilled beef slices before the guards outside announced, reporting to Honored Lady, General Sima, Captain Gua, Captain He, Lieutenant Xiao and Lieutenant Zhang are here. The corners of her lips twitched. What was up with this group of people? Their noses were even better than those of dogs. They were somehow able to come by every time she was having a meal. Wenqing and Wanlan both stiffened and froze at the same time, their faces turning pale. They exchanged troubled looks. What were they to do? Third young master's chest plate was still serving as the frying pan over the fire. Chu Lian demolished the remaining beef slices on her plate in record speed and with absolute calm before standing up and straightening out her clothes. As expected, in a short moment, the tent flap was lifted from outside and her visitors poured into the tent. The tent wasn't that big, so there was hardly any space left once everyone had entered. Everyone's eyes turned to the brazier next to Chu Lian the moment they entered the tent, their eyes filled with curiosity and expectation. Xiao Hongyu was the first to lose to his curiosity. He strode over to Chu Lian, not forgetting to give her a greeting bow, before asking her with wide, sparkling eyes, "Sister-in-law, what are you cooking now? It smells delicious." Chu Lian couldn't hold back the twitch in her eyes any longer. These gluttons. The first thing on their minds wasn't asking after her well-being, but eyeing the table and plates in front of her. Was this really how they should be acting? However, Chu Lian couldn't share her honest thoughts with these gluttons, so she could only summon up her well of patience and reply, "I'm not used to the food here in the army and I had nothing to do, so I made these with my maidservants. They're just some small snacks. If it seems interesting to you, please feel free to have a taste." That invite was exactly what the gluttons had been waiting for. When they heard her words, their faces lit up with delight. They had been stuck in the meeting in the commander's tent for almost the entire day. In the afternoon, all they had was just bean paste. They were absolutely starving right now. If not for Chu Lian's status and gender, they would probably have come charging in to snatch her food when they had smelled that delicious aroma, rather than trying to be polite. Sima Hui formed a cupped fist salute with her hands in Chu Lian's direction. The manly gesture didn't seem out of place with her military outfit. Instead, it made her seem even more dashing and bold. "Honored Lady Genie, my name is Sima Hui. I'll be troubling you today." Sima Hui was half a head taller than Chu Lian. She had long legs, a narrow waist, and a heroic aura. Her eyes were slightly tilted upwards at their corners, giving her sharp features a hint of loveliness. Chu Lian met her eyes and saw the resolution in her gaze, so she bobbed in reply and smiled with good intentions. As she expected, Sima Hui wasn't the kind of woman who would be narrow-minded or a stickler for social conventions. Chapter 373, Gathering for a Meal, 2. He Changdi hadn't looked at Sima Hui since the start, although it wasn't clear if he was simply presenting his best behavior in front of Chu Lian or trying to avoid suspicion. His gaze darted to Chu Lian's tiny face from time to time. When he saw that her almond-shaped eyes were looking brightly at Sima Hui with admiration, he felt a sudden wave of dissatisfaction within. This wicked woman had never looked at him with worship like that. What? Could it be that he couldn't be compared to Sima Hui in her eyes? He Sanlang's hands curled into fists, and his dislike towards Sima Hui grew even more. Captain Gua poked his head out of the tent and ordered the nearby guards to bring over a few more tables. There were 6 of them here, and the tiny side table in the tent wasn't enough to accommodate all of them. The guards worked quickly and brought over 4 tables in just 15 minutes. All of them were part of the army and Sima Hui was a female general. Chu Lian was a married woman with her husband right there with them, so they sat together without any restraint. The person with the highest status, Sima Hui, was given the right to pick her seat first. However, she shook her head and smiled before allowing Chu Lian to find a seat first. Following that, before the rest had a chance to speak, she sat herself right next to Chu Lian. Chu Lian admired how outspoken and straightforward Sima Hui was, so she had no issue with having the general right next to her. About half a meter away from Chu Lian's side, Wenqing and Wanlan were still grilling slices of beef and mutton. She turned and gave them some orders. When she turned back, she was met with the sight of expressionless He Changdi pulling away a wailing Xiao Hongyu from her side and seating himself in the remaining seat next to her. Xiao Hongyu couldn't beat He Sanlang, so he could only admit defeat and sit next to He Sanlang instead. Captain Gua and Zhang Mai were already old friends, so they picked a seat without any fuss. Actually, Xiao Hongyu didn't have any other intentions. He just wanted to sit a little closer to the brazier where the amazing food was being cooked, so he could eat more. It was just a teeny-tiny request, but brother, he refused to fulfill it. What a good sworn brother. Chu Lian took 2 plates of grilled beef slices from Wanlan and placed them in the center of the combined table. She pointed at a plate with lighter-colored slices and explained, "These are teppanyaki beef slices. The ones in this plate are just plain, and the ones in this other plate are spicy. If you've never eaten spicy food before, be careful when you're eating these. Take a small bite so you won't choke on the spiciness." Captain Gua and the rest weren't going to stand on ceremony before a delicious spread like this, especially Xiao Hongyu. He had eaten at the He estate before, so he knew that honored Lady Jeannie's servants cooked very tasty food. If not for Sima Hui's presence, he would probably have stolen one of the plates for himself and run off. Right before Chu Lian finished speaking, the men before her were already gulping down the food voraciously. The grilled beef slices were lean and seasoned well. The special seasoning complemented the natural taste of the beef, bringing tears to the eyes of the men who had been eating bean paste for a month. Sob, sob, sob. This was proper human food. That bean paste they had been eating was only fit for feeding pigs. The wretched sight of the 3 men eating didn't faze He Sanlang at all. He sat ramrod straight at the table without touching his chopsticks. His eyes seemed to be fixed on the table, but he was actually watching Chu Lian from the corner of his gaze. It was Sima Hui's first time seeing Captain Gua and the rest eat like that. She was stunned and could only continue staring blankly for some time. It was only when Chu Lian spoke up from beside her that she finally regained her senses. Chu Lian was already used to seeing reactions like those of Captain Gua and the rest after opening Gillen restaurant. She remained calm, as if it was completely normal to be wolfing down food like Xiao Hongyu and the others were doing. Sima Hui was starting to wonder if she was the one who was abnormal for not reacting like that. Chu Lian kindly reminded her, "General Sima, please have a taste. They're eating really fast." It was only then that Sima Hui picked up her chopsticks and reached towards the plate. Unfortunately, she was still too late. The last slice of spicy beef was quickly taken away by Xiao Hongyu. Sima Hui. Chu Lian. Xiao Hongyu didn't notice that he was being judged at all. He was still immersed in the delicious food. The spicy ones seemed to carry more flavor and were even better than the normal beef slices. Chu Lian was too lazy to reason with a glutton like Xiao Hongyu. She shot a look at the busy Wenqing, who quickly passed over a smaller plate to Chu Lian. There were 2 freshly grilled beef slices on the small dish. She set the dish in front of Sima Hui and smiled. "General Sima, please try this." As thick-skinned as Xiao Hongyu was, he still didn't have the guts to steal from Sima Hui's dish. He could only chew on his chopsticks with a pitiful look on his face. Sima Hui used her chopsticks to pick up a slice of beef and blew on it first, before putting it into her mouth. She chewed once, twice, before her eyes abruptly lit up. Following that, her chewing got faster and faster. Even though she had been raised on the best delicacies that money could buy and she had eaten plenty of good food back in Shandong, Chu Lian's little beef slices had already conquered her taste buds in seconds. Chapter 374. Not afraid of a little spice? 1. Chu Lian smiled after seeing Sima Hui's reaction. It looked like the teppanyaki suited her tastes. Wanlan served up another bowl of lamb organ soup for everyone. Chu Lian held up her bowl with 2 hands and sipped slowly. Since the soup was piping hot, her cheeks were flushed red from the heart. She said, "This isn't anything fancy. It's made from lamb intestines. It's good for keeping your body warm, though." The intestines of cows, sheep, and pigs were not considered good ingredients in the Great Wu dynasty. They were seen as some byproducts of killing livestock. Only the families who were really poor and couldn't afford other types of ingredients would eat them. Everyone had been drinking the soup happily. Upon hearing the truth from Chu Lian, their eyes almost popped out of their sockets. Captain Guo was in absolute disbelief. He looked at his empty bowl and looked again at the steaming pot of soup boiling over the brazier. "Is this really made from lamb intestines?" Chu Lian blinked. "Didn't you just eat it for yourself?" Once Captain Guo had confirmed the truth with Chu Lian, he slapped his leg in anger and his whole person seemed to sag. He looked rather depressed. Chu Lian found it strange and didn't understand why Captain Guo had such a huge reaction. She set down the bowl in her hands. "Brother Guo, please don't worry. Although this soup is made from lamb intestines, Wenqing and Wanlan have already cleaned them thoroughly. You won't get ill from eating this." The people of the Great Wu dynasty didn't dare to eat intestines because some people had fallen ill after eating them. As the news passed by word of mouth, it became that no one dared to eat intestines any longer. It was true that it was easy to get infected with some sort of bacteria or virus by eating unclean animal organs. However, as long as the organs were washed carefully, there wouldn't be any problems. He Changdi drank a mouthful of the soup. For some reason, although he was absolutely starving, when he saw how Chu Lian was ignoring him, he just couldn't muster up any appetite. Zhang Mai shook his head. He was the one who understood Captain Guo the most here. "Honored lady, it's not what you think. Captain Guo is regretting how he threw away all the intestines before this. The border army had slaughtered livestock like cows and sheep to preserve the meat for winter. Those intestines and organs had been immediately thrown away and buried. If they had known that these organs could be made into such a delicious soup, they wouldn't have wasted a single cow intestine. If they had kept those organs, their army would have a few more days of supplies." The party had only come over for a free meal. No one expected the mood to turn depressing so suddenly. Captain Guo, Zhang Mai, and Xiao Hongyu all sunk into silence. He Changdi's face had been cold from the start. Sima Hui joined them with an expression of deep thought. Chu Lian really hadn't expected a simple bowl of lamb organ soup to have provoked such reactions from them. She rolled her eyes speechlessly. What was the use of regretting it now? Those organs had long been buried. By now, the organs must be decomposing naturally. Even if they regretted it, it wasn't as if they could dig up the organs and eat them now. Wasn't it good enough to take note of this knowledge and apply it in the future? While Chu Lian was remaining calm, it didn't mean that the others shared her open-mindedness. Wenqing and Wanlan were getting anxious watching them. Once the atmosphere in the tent had taken a turn for the worse, the 2 sisters' actions had become more careful as they continued grilling meat. Wanlan's hand trembled, accidentally moving the chest plate and causing it to make an ear-piercing screech as it rubbed against the steel wire mesh it was balanced upon. Following that, it wobbled and fell off the wire mesh, letting out a clear cling-clang. Everyone was jolted back to their senses, and they turned towards the sound in unison. Wenqing and Wanlan's faces turned pale as they tried their best to blend into the walls. When 6 pairs of eyes focused on the object still shaking and wobbling on the floor, they shared a sense of familiarity. This round plate didn't seem like a wok. Although it had been charred black by the fire in the center and was covered in glistening oil, the sides that hadn't been burned looked like shiny golden metal. They were all officers in the army, and for all soldiers shared the same style of armor apart from the generals. Even Sima Hui's armor looked about the same, except for the 2 chest plates in the front. Suddenly, in uncoordinated unison, everyone turned towards the armor hanging on the wooden rack in the tent, and sweat drops seemed to form simultaneously on their faces. Chu Lian immediately realized that they had found out that her teppanyaki plate was the chest plate on He Sanlang's armor. However, she had already used it right in front of them, so it wasn't good to explain too much at this moment. Anyway, they had all eaten it together. They couldn't scold her now after eating her food. Chu Lian was very thick-skinned. She acted as if it were nothing. He Changdi was the first to lose his temper. He cast a cold gaze over the defaced chest plate and pressed his lips together. With gritted teeth, he shouted, "Chu Lian, is this your doing?" After getting shouted at by Yi Sanlang, Chu Lian did feel a little guilty. She tried to soften him up by giving him a sweet smile. The group saw that tension was rising between the couple, so they immediately made their escape. Sima Hui hadn't expected that the normally cool and reserved Yi Sanlang had moments where he showed his anger. She stared in stunned astonishment. Xiao Hongyu stood outside the tent in the cold and breezy night. "Brother Gua, Brother Zhang, let me sleep over in your tent tonight." Brother, he was way too scary just now. The two of them completely ignored Xiao Hongyu's request and ran away as fast as they could. Sima Hui stood outside the tent with a smile. She really hadn't expected to see that was how He Changdi and his wife got along. When that calm, intelligent, and cold He Sanlang was in front of honored Lady Genie, it was as if his divine aura had suddenly been lifted and he had become a real, living human being with emotions, rather than a cruel and heartless robot. The couple seemed to be getting along very well. How could anyone possibly get in between them? Xiaoyan had really been too naive. When she thought of Xiaoyan, Sima Hui let a long sigh. She left Xiaoju behind with some instructions before bringing the rest of her party back to her tent. TL note: my editor reminded me that CL's actions are very similar to this. There's a YouTube channel where a Chinese lady called Ms. Ye uses random things in her office to cook food in the coolest and weirdest of ways. XD, go check out her videos and be amazed. Chapter 375. Not afraid of a little spice? 2. Only He Sanlang and Chu Lian were left in the tent now. Wenqing and Wan Lan had already made their escape. If this had been a normal day, Chu Lian would definitely have been stubborn and hard-headed. However, she just couldn't summon up her courage today. She snuck a glance at the missing space in front of the armor and made a silent prayer for herself. Her body had just been warmed up by the soup, but now her lunatic husband had gone and made things all cold again. When she looked at how He Sanlang was sitting up straight at the side without moving, as if he were a statue, Chu Lian felt extremely awkward. After a long moment of silence, Chu Lian lost her patience first. "It was my mistake today. I'll compensate you with another set of armor." He Changdi looked straight at his wife, who had her head slightly lowered. All the anger in him had already disappeared when their guests had left. Seeing how she had shrunk back into herself like a scared little bunny, the reprimand that he had been about to unleash remained stuck in his throat. Thinking back to the snowboat that she had gifted to him this morning, He Changdi's heart softened. This woman had thought about him at the first moment. She had given him that precious blueprint without any caution at all. No one knew the value of that snowboat better than he did. His image of her was slowly pulling away from the wicked woman from his previous life. When he thought of that, He Sanlang's frozen heart melted into a pile of water, as if spring had already come. The issue with the armor became inconsequential to him. Looking again at the timid-looking Chu Lian, he just couldn't bear to speak any words of scolding. Luckily, He Changdi was the kind who kept his guard up and his thoughts to himself. He wouldn't share his thoughts just like that. Otherwise, if Chu Lian were to reveal the real reason for giving him the snowboat, rather than presenting it herself, he would be the one to puke blood in anger. Chu Lian was still waiting for her lunatic husband to scold her with her head lowered. Who could have thought that she wouldn't hear anything from He Changdi at all, even though her neck was already starting to hurt? She looked up and cast a quick glance at He Changdi, only to realize that he was looking at her with that deep gaze of his. The emotions swirling in his eyes were just too strange. Chu Lian shivered. Why did she feel like he was going to eat her up in the next instant? After getting caught by Chu Lian, He Changdi shifted his gaze away and coughed awkwardly. Following that, he picked up the chest plate from the floor. Under Chu Lian's frightened gaze, he wiped the chest plate clean and placed it back over the brazier. He moved a plate of raw beef slices that hadn't been grilled in front of Chu Lian. "Cook this?" Chu Lian thought that she was hallucinating and replied with a dazed, "Ah?" He Changdi tried his best to adjust his expression and make it as neutral as possible, instead of cool. "I didn't eat just now. I'm still hungry." Chu Lian shot a doubtful glance at him. She hadn't been watching him just now, so she didn't know if he was speaking the truth. Had he really not eaten at all just now? When He Changdi's eyes met hers, Chu Lian could only admit defeat and help him grill the meat. As Chu Lian skillfully flipped the beef slices on the metal plate, the meat made sizzling sounds. She took up the plate of seasoning at the side and asked, "Do you eat spicy food?" He Changdi was staring at Chu Lian's fair hands, lost in thought. He didn't seem to hear Chu Lian's question at all. Chu Lian made an exaggerated roll of her eyes. What was going on with her lunatic husband? It was bad enough that he had chased everyone out of the tent. Now he was making her cook for him personally. However, when she asked him what flavor he would like to have, he was actually being absent-minded. Chu Lian continued complaining in her heart and, accidentally, shook her hand twice, adding in twice the usual amount of chili powder. Hee. Since you're not going to reply, I'll let you have all the spice. She finished grilling the beef slices quickly and placed them neatly on a plate. They looked delicious and alluring. Chu Lian personally set the dish in front of He Sanlang. He Sanlang stared at the grilled beef slices in front of him, finally feeling satisfied. His wife should only care for him alone and cook for him alone. Although He Changdi was happy within, there wasn't much change in his expression. Chu Lian sat back down next to him and watched as he used his wooden chopsticks to put a slice of meat into his mouth. In the next second, He Changdi's body stiffened up for an instant before returning to normal. He Sanlang ate very elegantly. Even though he was moving his chopsticks quickly, his motions were still a joy to watch. As Chu Lian watched him devour piece after piece until all the meat on the plate was gone, her eyes widened in shock. What was going on? Had He Changdi been born in Sichuan in his previous life? How was he so good at eating spicy food? She had been the one to grill the meat, and she had brought the chili powder over from the capital. She knew very well how spicy it was. Chu Lian was already considered someone who could hold her spice. The chili powder that she had made was already spicy enough when she used about a fingernail's worth of it. When she had been cooking the meat for He Changdi, she had used 2 to 3 times the usual amount. His expression hadn't even changed when he had been eating that meat, as if nothing unusual had happened. If not for the lack of any spicy seasoning like this chili powder in the Great Wu Dynasty, Chu Lian might have suspected that he was the kind to eat only spicy food. However, Chu Lian found out very quickly that she was wrong. Chapter 376. It's hard to say sorry. 1. Chu Lian stared at He Sanlang in astonishment. Isn't it spicy? He Changdi's thin lips were slightly swollen. He licked them and continued his pretense of calm. It was okay. Chu Lian's eyes focused on his face, her almond-shaped eyes seemingly trying to discern whether he had been telling the truth. Her gaze drifted down to his neck. He Changdi's skin was fair, and the clothes he had on now were a dark color, making the color of the skin on his neck even more obvious. His originally pale skin was now completely flushed red. There was also a thin layer of sweat on his neck, indicating that He Changdi probably hadn't been telling the truth. Chu Lian went into a daze for a moment before she shifted her gaze away to the unassuming dark green collar on his neck. The collar peeking out was from the undershirt he wore within. Although it was just a tiny sliver of collar, Chu Lian managed to recognize the undershirt instantly. This was definitely the undershirt that Liu had embroidered that Wenqing had accidentally packed for him. Dark green was an unassuming color, so it shouldn't be noticeable when worn on the inside. However, since it was Liu's first time doing embroidery, she wasn't very good at picking a matching thread color. Although it was a dark-colored shirt and she had intended on doing some patterns on the collar, she should have picked something closer to the shirt's color. However, Liu had picked out some shiny thread with the color of autumn leaves, thus making the crooked embroidery on the collar especially obvious. It was extremely eye-catching. Chu Lian fell into a daze and stared at the embroidery for too long, causing He Sanlang to notice that something was wrong. He looked downwards and realized that he was still wearing the undershirt that his wife had embroidered for him. His ears flushed red instantly. The atmosphere within the tent was slowly turning a little weird. When Chu Lian finally regained her senses, her face wrinkled up into a strange expression. She knew that He Changdi had probably assumed that that undershirt was her handiwork. She was trapped in a dilemma now. Should she tell him the truth or not? Once she thought of the fits of insanity that He Changdi seemed prone to from time to time, she decided to remain silent on the matter for the sake of her own safety. If the truth ever came to light, she could honestly say that she had never claimed to have any part in making that undershirt. However, Chu Lian still felt a little guilty for now. She turned and poured a cup of warm water for him, explaining kindly, "The taste of the grilled beef is a little strong. Why don't you have some warm water to rinse away the flavor?" He Sanlang coughed twice to hide his struggle before nodding. When he took the cup, he immediately drained it in one gulp. Chu Lian secretly watched from the side. Upon seeing how urgently he was drinking the water, she knew that she had guessed correctly. She thought back to how he had been eating so fervently, and she felt a little touched. If they had switched places and she had been the one served with those extremely spicy beef slices, she probably wouldn't have been able to down a single one. They were just like a loving couple. The husband would eat his wife's cooking without complaint, regardless of how it tasted, because it was made by his wife. For the sake of making her happy, he would pretend to love eating the food and polish off every last bit of food on the plate. Chu Lian realized that He Changdi had the habit of never wasting any food. He had been like this even back at Songtao Court, and even more so when eating that terrible bean paste. Although He Sanlang's personality was too aloof sometimes, and he would have random periods of insanity from time to time, her heart softened immediately. She wanted to treat him a little better. She promised to herself never to tease him in that manner ever again, and to always cook delicious food for him. Once He Sanlang got over the burning feeling in his mouth, he sipped a mouthful of lamb organ soup. He pressed his lips together in hesitation before finally gathering the courage to say, "Chu Lian, many thanks to you for your help." Chu Lian blinked in surprise, and the corners of her lips curled up. It was just a small suggestion. "It's good if it'll be useful to you." She acted so casually that He Sanlang didn't know what else to say. The depths of his eyes were as fathomless as the night sky, dotted with the light of faraway stars, as thoughts ran through his mind. He Changdi finally let go of the unseen chains tying his mind to his past life. Although many things were similar, there were just as many changes in this life. Everything seemed to have been reset. How could he be sure that the Chu Lian before him was the same Chu Lian from his past life? Other than sharing the same face, their personalities were completely different. He no longer wanted to escape reality. Despite how much he wanted to argue against it, a voice was calling out from deep within and reminding him that he had already fallen in love with the Chu Lian right in front of him. This was an unavoidable truth that he didn't want to admit. Chu Lian had described how she had invented the snowboat as if it was a normal, everyday thing to do, and it had indeed been as easy as drinking and eating for her. However, that wasn't what He Sanlang thought. After getting hurt so deeply and encasing himself in unbreakable ice, He Changdi had thought that he would never develop feelings for any woman ever again. Who could have expected that his heart would fall for his greatest sworn enemy? It was fortunate that his personality was strong enough to withstand this turn of events, or he might have made himself go crazy for real. There was a period of silence within the tent that made Chu Lian feel like years had passed instead of just minutes. She adjusted her skirt and wondered whether she should try to take her leave. It was only then that she suddenly heard He Changdi's low, magnetic voice speaking. "Chu Lian, let's get along well from now on." Chapter 377. It's hard to say sorry, too. He Changdi had used up every bit of courage in his body to say those words. However, after speaking, he found that he had only become even more nervous. His gaze subconsciously landed on Chu Lian's face. There was no good way to describe what Chu Lian's expression looked like now. The closest approximation was like she had stepped in dog poop. Sigh. This lunatic He Sanlang. When had she ever not tried to get along with him? She had focused on cooking good food to raise her standard of living, respected her elders, and even earnestly started a business to earn money. She was living perfectly well. She wasn't the one throwing fits of lunacy since their wedding night. Chu Lian fought the urge to smile out of overwhelming anger. Wasn't it lucky for him that she was the He family's third young madam? If he had said that to any other noble lady, wouldn't they have expired on the spot from frustration? When He Changdi noticed the mocking expression on Chu Lian's face, His body froze up and his lips pressed together into a thin line as his expression turned colder and colder. The hands hidden under his sleeves slowly tensed into fists. He wanted to speak, but he found that he couldn't say a word when faced with the sort of expression on Chu Lian's face. Chu Lian tilted her head to the side and started examining the tall He Sanlang the Fair, who would still tower over her by half a head even when seated. At this moment, He Sanlang's fine features were contorted with tension. There was an aura of restraint around him, as if he was a dog trying to suppress the feelings of having been abandoned by his master. Chu Lian smiled. He Changdi, what's with that pitiful act? It's not like I abandoned you. He Sanlang's current expression was extremely entertaining. He stared at Chu Lian with wide eyes. Her reply had been completely out of his expectations. Before he could gather his wits to summon a reply, Chu Lian continued her tirade. Haven't you realized it yet? I've always been trying to get along with you. Otherwise, why would I have come all the way out to this poor and desolate place? Why else would I be sitting right next to you now? Are you taking me for a fool? The fog covering He Sanlang's eyes seemed to have lifted in an instant. Shame and guilt flashed through his eyes. Chu Lian's mocking words felt like a slap to his face. Although it didn't hurt, he was still upset. That's right. Hadn't he been the one determined not to get along with her? Although he hadn't caused any physical or fatal harm to Chu Lian's body, ever since their wedding day, all of his actions had been damaging Chu Lian's reputation and self-respect. How hilarious. How could he have had the guts to ask Chu Lian to get along well with him? He deserved every word of ridicule from her. He Sanlang pressed his lips and parted them, yet he just couldn't let a single sound out. The smile on Chu Lian's face slowly faded away. She looked up at that handsome face with her almond-shaped eyes. He Changdi, is it so hard to say that you're sorry? Chu Lian no longer wanted to wait for his apology. She abruptly stood up, but her legs were numb from kneeling down for too long. Her body refused to listen to her commands and wavered. He Changdi was about to reach out to support her, but Chu Lian recovered her balance and stabilized herself before he could do so. He Changdi's outstretched arms looked pitifully lonely and useless. He lowered them in desolation. Chu Lian watched all this happen, but her heart was set. He Changdi, it's getting late. Lieutenant Xiao must be suffering in the cold wind outside. You have a mission to carry out tomorrow as well, so I'll stop bothering you. After leaving behind these words, Chu Lian turned and quickly left. Although her figure seemed slender and weak, she moved faster than expected. She was already long gone by the time He Changdi thought to chase after her. When Chu Lian stepped out of the tent, the cold northern winds were like a slap to her face, instantly calming down her tumultuous emotions. Chu Lian took in a deep breath, but her expression didn't improve. The tent had muffled all the sounds from inside, so Xiao Hongyu, Wenqing and Wanlan didn't know what the couple had discussed. However, judging from Chu Lian's expression, all of them could tell that the couple had fought. Wanlan quickly hurried forward to wrap a cloak around Chu Lian. Xiaoju stepped up to welcome her. Honored lady, our general has charged this subordinate with the duty of leading honored lady to a place to sleep. Captain Gua had been intending to send Chu Lian over to the women's camp for the night anyway. It was even better that Sima Hui had sent one of her most trusted adjutants over to lead Chu Lian there personally. Chu Lian smiled at Xiaoju. She wasn't an unreasonable person. Then I'll be troubling your general. I'll head over right now. Although it was Xiaoju's first time interacting with Chu Lian, she felt that it was easy to interact with the baby-faced honored Lady Jeannie. Her personality was also straightforward, unlike most of the noble ladies in the capital. Xiaoju was already used to living in the army with her mistress, so she hated the way that noble ladies would talk in circles with hidden meanings. It was better to be honest and direct in everything. Chu Lian followed Xiaoju to Sima Hui's tent with Wenqing and Wanlan behind her. When He Sanlang came out of his tent, all that he caught was Chu Lian's slender back walking into the flurry of snow. Noticing that He Changdi's expression was very gloomy, Xiao Hongyu acted appropriately for once and said, Brother He, sister-in-law has gone over to General Sima's camp. Don't worry, Brother Gua has already made a proper request to General Sima. The general won't mistreat sister-in-law. He Changdi didn't reply Xiao Hongyu. He simply stood at the tent entrance and watched until Chu Lian's silhouette had completely faded into the darkness of the snowy night. He finally turned around and returned to the tent. However, for some reason, when he heard from Xiao Hongyu that Sima Hui had sent her trusted female adjutant to welcome Chu Lian, there was a hint of upset in his heart. You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.